Hello everyone, I am the Creep's Cabin. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. It was February 14th, 1989, and the chill of winter had settled into the small town of Biscay, Minnesota. I was with my then girlfriend, and we were driving home late that night. The snow had already covered the ground. The fields outside the car window were empty and silent. It was a clear, moonless night, and the roads were nearly deserted. Nothing unusual, just another cold Tuesday evening in the Midwest. We were driving along a quiet stretch of highway just outside of town when I noticed something strange. At first, it was a faint, almost indistinct light hovering over the field off to the side. It wasn't the flicker of a distant farm light or a car's headlights. No, this light was different, distinctive and bright. It had an odd, sharp quality to it, and I couldn't place it. I leaned forward in my seat to get a better look, straining my eyes in the dark. "Stop the car," I said. My voice was low, but it was laced with a sense of urgency. "What is it?" she asked, her eyes widening in concern. "Just pull over." "Something's not right," I replied. She was hesitant, but did as I asked, guiding the car onto the shoulder of the road and bringing it to a slow stop. The engine rumbled softly as we both stared at the scene unfolding in the distance. The lights were still hovering in the same spot, but now that we were stopped, I could see them more clearly. They were unmistakably aircraft lights, green and red wingtip lights flashing softly against the inky sky. But there was something off. I was no expert on aircraft, but I knew a thing or two about planes. I'd spent enough time around them to recognize their typical behavior. These were not normal aircraft. I could tell that right away. Most planes, even the quietest ones, have some kind of noise. They make a hum, a whine, or some sort of engine noise. But these were different. They were perfectly silent. As I watched them hover motionless over the field, a chill ran down my spine. The oddest part, there was nothing beneath them. No building, no infrastructure, no reason for these lights to be hovering over a field in the middle of nowhere. I turned to my girlfriend, who was staring wide-eyed at the lights, her mouth slightly open in disbelief. "Those aren't smokestacks," I said almost to myself, though I knew she would hear. She had initially thought the lights belonged to smokestacks at some industrial site, but there was nothing here, just open fields. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us taking in the sight of these lights. As we watched, the two aircraft started to slowly move forward. Not quickly, just a steady, deliberate pace, their lights glowing softly in the darkness. They seemed to notice us as we parked and got out of the car. The motion of the aircraft shifted, and they began to drift, almost as if they were adjusting their course to stay within view. I could feel my pulse quicken. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I felt a wave of uncertainty wash over me. But I couldn't take my eyes off the aircraft. My girlfriend was beside me, trembling, but she didn't say anything. I could tell she was just as confused and unsettled as I was. The craft appeared to float effortlessly. They moved with the grace of something that defied the laws of physics. I'd seen helicopters hover, but these were not helicopters. They were too quiet for that, and there was no rotor sound, no whirling blades in the air. They just sat there, almost motionless, with just the slightest shift forward every now and then. My curiosity was growing by the second. I stepped further out into the snow-covered field, trying to get a better look. The streetlight up the road gave off a dull yellow-orange glow, casting long shadows on the ground. As I squinted up at the craft, trying to see more details, I began to notice other features. The shapes of the aircraft were all wrong. They weren't sleek or aerodynamic like commercial jets. These were different. Their edges were angular, almost truck-like. They had a solid, bulky feel to them, not at all the type of shape you would expect from a modern, cutting-edge aircraft. There was no visible fuselage curve or smoothness. The wings were flat and rigid. I moved a little closer, my breath catching in the cold air. I could see two bright yellowish-white lights shining down from just behind the wings, casting beams onto the ground below. They seemed to be fixed in place, pointing directly down toward the earth. I looked up at the tail of the aircraft. It was oddly shaped, downward-canted tailplanes, tapering to conical tips. The design wasn't like any plane I had seen before. The cockpit was barely visible, just a shadow against the dark sky, and the more I looked at it, the more confused I became. There was something distinctly military about the shape, but it was nothing I recognized. Then, I saw something else that sent a shiver down my spine. Beneath the nose of the craft, there was a rotating red beacon, a small but unmistakable light that seemed to pulse slowly. It reminded me of the beacons you see on military aircraft, but even then, it didn't match anything I could recall. The more I stared at it, the more the whole scene felt wrong. Nothing about these craft was familiar. I felt my legs go stiff with tension, but I didn't move. My eyes remained locked on the aircraft, wondering if it would suddenly vanish, if this was some weird illusion, or if I would wake up and realize this was just a strange dream. But it wasn't. This was real. The moment felt like it was stretching on forever. Then, without any warning, I raised my hand and waved at them, not even sure why I did it. Maybe it was a test, maybe it was an impulse, but as soon as I did, something changed. The engines, which I hadn't even heard up until then, suddenly roared to life. A low, deep hum filled the air, and the aircraft slowly veered from their hovering position. They pivoted, moving to the southeast, gliding away from us in a manner that almost seemed deliberate, as if they were acknowledging us, or maybe just deciding that we weren't worth paying attention to anymore. My girlfriend let out a soft gasp and stepped back, fear evident in her eyes. But I felt drawn to keep watching. Something inside me urged me to understand, to figure out what this was, to keep looking. I could hear the faint hum of their engines as they accelerated, moving smoothly and effortlessly through the air. They began to pick up speed, and within moments they were gone, disappearing into the dark horizon with a speed I could never match in my car. "Let's go," my girlfriend whispered, pulling on my arm. She was still shaken, but I couldn't bring myself to leave just yet. I wanted answers, but there were none. There were no explanations, no clues. Only an empty field and a fading memory of what had just happened. We got back in the car, and I glanced over at her. She was silent, still processing everything, her hands clenched in her lap. I could feel the weight of the experience in the air. It hung between us, unspoken but present. I started the car and slowly pulled back onto the road, my mind racing, my thoughts scattered. What had we just seen? Were they military aircraft? Were they something else entirely? We didn't speak much on the way home. There wasn't much to say. It wasn't until later, when I was talking to my neighbor, who had flown for Northwest Airlines for years, that I learned something interesting. I mentioned the location of our sighting, and he paused before responding. He told me that Biscay, Minnesota, was sometimes used as a transit corridor for aircraft moving between different parts of the country. I wasn't sure what that meant exactly, but it gave me a small inkling that this might not have been some freak occurrence. Still, it didn't explain the strange, quiet nature of the craft. A few weeks later, through a contact, I got in touch with Jim Goodall, an aviation author known for his research into classified military projects. After hearing about my sighting, he seemed intrigued. He mentioned that there had been rumors of prototype stealthy vertical takeoff and landing, VS/TWL, aircraft being tested in the Midwest and Michigan. This piqued my interest. Could what we saw that night have been one of those experimental planes? That thought lingered with me for years. I'd never be able to fully answer the question. But as time passed, I realized that it didn't really matter. I had witnessed something that most people would never even believe, let alone understand. And even if I never got the answers I was hoping for, I knew I would always carry that night with me. It's been more than 24 years now, and I still remember that night in vivid detail. The way the lights looked, the silent hum of the aircraft, the strange truck-like shape. I don't know what they were, but I feel lucky to have seen them. I may never know the full truth, but I'll always carry the memory of that night, the silent craft in the field, and the realization that sometimes, some mysteries are just too strange to explain. And maybe that's for the best. It was the last day of my fall break, and I wanted to make the most of it. Me and two of my friends had been talking about it all week, about how we needed to go out and just let loose before the school grind started again. We decided to meet up and start a fire by the creek near my house. It was a spot we had been to a few times before, but this time, we were planning to take it a little further. The spot was on a cliff above the creek, so no one could really see us from the street or the surrounding houses. It was secluded, quiet, and gave off a sense of freedom that we were all craving. We gathered whatever we could find, old newspapers, sticks, some dry leaves we found nearby, and a couple of lighter fluid cans we grabbed from home. By the time we got there, it was around 10 o'clock, and the air was starting to get that cool, crisp feeling that you only get at night during the fall. The fire started to crackle after a few tries, and we threw some more things on it, watching the flames grow higher. The heat from the fire felt good against the chill in the air. We sat there for a while, talking about random stuff, laughing, and just soaking in the peace of being alone out there in the dark. The only sounds were the fire, the occasional rustle of leaves from the wind, and the soft babbling of the creek down below. About 20 minutes later, we decided to put the fire out. We stomped on it until the flames were down to embers, and then poured some water from the creek over it to make sure it was completely out. By then, it was around 10:30, and we figured it was time to head out. We decided to walk to the local McDonald's since it was only a few blocks away, and we were all craving something to eat. We walked through the field that led to the street, with me in front, my two friends behind me. The night was still, and the sky was mostly clear, with just a few scattered clouds blocking out the stars. The field was pretty large, with tall grass swaying in the breeze, and a few trees dotted along the edges. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect anything strange to happen. As I walked through the field, I kept my eyes ahead of me, trying to keep the pace up. But then something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just some trash, or maybe an old blanket someone had left behind. But as I took a few more steps, I realized it wasn't any of that. There was something, or rather someone, lying in the field. At first, I didn't know what to think. It looked like a sleeping bag, but there was something about the shape that didn't sit right. The way it was positioned, it didn't look like it had just been tossed there carelessly. It almost looked like it was placed there intentionally. As I stepped closer, I could make out the distinct shape of a head at the end of the sleeping bag. The head was covered by a beanie, but the neck was exposed. I froze. A sickening chill ran through me. My heart started to race, and I couldn't breathe for a moment. My mind was spinning. Was it really a person? Or was it some kind of trick? I didn't know, but I couldn't just leave without checking. I yelled out, "Dead body," without even thinking. My friends, who were still a few steps behind, rushed up to me. Without waiting for them to catch up, I bolted. My legs were already moving before my brain could even process what was going on. I ran straight through the field, not looking back, just focusing on putting distance between myself and whatever it was out there. My friends followed closely behind, but I didn't stop. We reached McDonald's in a blur, out of breath and wide-eyed. Once we sat down in a booth, we all just stared at each other for a moment. We were scared, confused, and adrenaline was still coursing through us. But as we started to catch our breath, we began to laugh, partly out of nervousness, partly because I'd slipped and face-planted in the field while I was running. It helped ease the tension a little, but the fear still gnawed at the back of my mind. We couldn't just leave it like that, though. We had to know if what I saw was really a dead body. The idea haunted me. After some discussion, we decided to go back, this time armed with something for protection. We went to one of my friend's houses and explained the situation to him. He was just as freaked out as we were, but he didn't hesitate to hand us a spare kitchen knife. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. It was around 11:50 by the time we made it back to the field. The quiet of the night felt oppressive as we stood at the opposite end of the field, preparing ourselves. The area was even darker now, and the only light came from our flashlights and the faint glow from the streetlights on the other side of the field. I felt a tightness in my chest. I wasn't sure what I expected, but it wasn't going to be good. We crossed the field, flashlights flicking around in the dark, illuminating patches of grass and dirt. When we finally reached the spot, I saw it again. The figure, lying in the same position as before. My heart pounded in my chest. I could feel my hands shaking as I held the knife in front of me. I slowly shined my flashlight on the figure, keeping my distance. The light revealed the shape more clearly. It was unmistakable now. It was a body. A person, wrapped in a sleeping bag or something similar, with a beanie covering their head. Only their neck was exposed, and the position was all wrong. The sight made my stomach twist. I couldn't believe it. I was staring at what appeared to be a dead person. My friends stood behind me, cameras in hand, ready to film, but neither of them seemed to be able to get a good look at it. Their flashlights didn't seem to illuminate it the way mine did. We were all too scared to move any closer. After a few seconds of frozen silence, I stepped back. We ran back to McDonald's, and once we caught our breath, we pulled out our phones and checked the footage. But none of my friends had captured anything clearly on camera. The body wasn't in the shots, despite being right there in front of us. We all sat there in silence for a while, the weight of what we had seen settling over us. None of us were brave enough to go back out that night. We decided to check back first thing in the morning, hoping maybe our minds had played tricks on us in the dark. The next morning, we returned. It was just after 8:30, and the sun had barely risen. The field looked completely different in the daylight, less ominous, less threatening. The place where we had seen the body was just empty grass. There was no sign of anything unusual. No body, no sleeping bag, nothing. We stood there for a long time, trying to process what had happened. The fact that it was gone made everything feel more surreal, like it had never been there at all. It was like a bad dream. But here's the thing that made it even worse. The creek is close to a neighborhood. So if it had been a dead body, if it was real, why hadn't anyone else noticed it? Why hadn't someone called the police? Why hadn't anyone in the neighborhood seen anything? We left the field that morning, still uneasy, still unsure of what had happened. But we didn't go back. Not that night, and not after that. Whatever it was, whatever we had seen, I didn't want to know any more about it. It's been a week since then, and I still can't shake the feeling that something was off. That we had come too close to something we weren't supposed to see. Sometimes, I think about it late at night. What if the body had been real? What if someone had just left it there for hours without anyone noticing? What if it was someone who had just disappeared, and no one ever found them? And the worst part is, I'll never know. I don't know why I used to cry so much when I was little. I don't know if it was something specific, or just the way I was back then, but I do know that it drove my parents crazy. At first, they would come in and try to calm me down, whispering reassurances, rubbing my back, tucking the blankets tighter around me. But after a while, when it became a pattern, they stopped. They'd just wait for me to cry myself to sleep. I remember the feeling of being alone in the dark, the way the silence of the house made everything worse. I remember how my chest would hurt from sobbing for so long, my throat raw, my body exhausted but my mind too scared to let go. The room felt too big at night. The shadows stretched in ways that didn't make sense. The stuffed animals on my shelf looked different, their glassy eyes reflecting the hallway light in ways that made them seem alive. But what I remember most, what has stuck with me long after I grew up, is what I saw one of those nights when I was still awake, still crying, still waiting for my body to finally give out and let me sleep. I saw them. Two little things, goblin-like, with red eyes that glowed in the dark. They weren't just standing there or watching me like you'd expect something scary to do. They were moving, flipping, rolling, somersaulting in the air like circus acrobats. The way they moved didn't seem possible. There was nothing for them to push off from, nothing for them to land on, but they still flipped and spun like they were swinging from invisible bars. And they laughed. The sound wasn't deep or guttural like you'd expect. It was light, playful, like kids having fun on a playground. I remember feeling frozen, my breath hitching between sobs. My body wanted to run, to move, to do anything, but all I could do was watch as they tumbled through the air, rolling and twisting, their red eyes flashing in the dark. I screamed for my mom. I squeezed my eyes shut as tight as I could, shaking my head, forcing my face into my pillow. I screamed and screamed, but I already knew she wasn't coming. She had stopped coming, and they kept laughing, kept flipping, kept playing. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have because the next thing I knew, the morning light was coming through my window. The room was empty. Everything looked normal, but I didn't feel normal. I was scared, but I was also confused. I didn't know if what I saw was real or if my exhausted, tear-soaked brain had made it up. I wanted to believe it wasn't real, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But even now, after all these years, I can still see them clear as day in my head. The way they moved, the way they laughed, the way their eyes burned in the dark. That wasn't the last time I saw something. Freshman year of high school. By then, I had stopped crying at night. I had stopped seeing things. At least, I thought I had. My parents probably thought I had grown out of it, and I did too, until the night I looked up at the balcony that overlooked our living room and saw her. She wasn't moving. She wasn't laughing. She wasn't flipping or tumbling through the air. She was just standing there, a dark silhouette of a girl in a dress, staring down at me. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, like when you look at something in the dark for too long and start seeing shapes that aren't really there. But the longer I looked, the more I could see. Her head was tilted down slightly, her hair hanging forward, but I could still make out her face. She was looking straight at me. My stomach dropped. My entire body tensed up, every muscle screaming at me to run. And I did. I bolted up the stairs, ran straight to my room, slammed the door, and locked it. My heart was pounding, so hard I thought I was going to throw up. I sat on my bed, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen, waiting for the doorknob to turn, waiting for footsteps, waiting for anything. But nothing happened. The house was silent. The next morning, I convinced myself I had imagined it. It was just my brain being stupid, just the dark playing tricks on me again. But then I saw her again. Not every night, but often enough that I knew it wasn't just my imagination. Every time, she was in the same place, standing on the balcony, looking down at me. Her face never changed. Her posture never changed. She never moved. At first, I reacted the same way every time. I would run. I would slam my door. I would stay locked in my room, breathing heavy, waiting for nothing to happen. But after a while, I stopped running. I don't know why. Maybe I got used to it. Maybe I was too tired to care. But I started forcing myself to just look at her. I would stare for 6-10 seconds at most, and then she would disappear. I never saw her leave. I never saw her walk away. It was like the second I blinked or shifted my focus, she was just gone. For a long time, I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want to sound crazy. But the more it happened, the more I started to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. I started trying to find reasons for it. Was it a trick of the light? A shadow from the furniture? But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I knew deep down that what I was seeing wasn't normal. Then one night, I decided to prove to myself that there was nothing there. I stayed downstairs longer than usual. I left the lights on. I walked around the living room, looking at the balcony from every angle, studying the shadows, trying to make sense of it. And then I looked up. She was there. And this time, something was different. Her head wasn't tilted down. She was looking straight at me, and I could see her eyes. I don't remember running up the stairs. I don't remember locking my door. I just remember sitting in my bed, shaking, staring at the floor. That was the last time I saw her. I don't know why she stopped appearing after that. I don't know what changed. Maybe I was just finally losing my mind, or maybe it was never really her I was seeing in the first place. Maybe it was something else. I try not to think about it too much. I tell myself that it was just my brain playing tricks on me, that I was overtired, that I was stressed, that I imagined all of it. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and I'm alone, I catch myself staring at the balcony, just in case. Late summer, the kind of night where the air is still warm, but has that first hint of fall creeping in, making the wind feel just a little cooler than it should. The sky was dark, but not pitch black, a hazy blue lingering over the town, keeping just enough light in the air to see without a flashlight. Me and my friend had been hanging out all evening, mostly just walking around, killing time. There wasn't much to do in our town, not at that hour. The streets were empty, the houses all dark, except for a few porch lights and the occasional bedroom window still glowing from a TV. We weren't tired, but we were getting bored, and that's when we got the idea to go exploring. There was a patch of undeveloped land on the edge of town, a place we had been to a few times before. It wasn't anything special, just overgrown grass, some dirt paths, and an old barbed wire fence that looked like it had been there forever. It wasn't exactly legal to be there, but no one really cared. It was just empty space, land that hadn't been built on yet. The kind of place kids went to mess around when they didn't want to be seen. The only real reason people avoided it was because of the fence, but me and my friend had a system. We got there just after 11. The town behind us was quiet, the streetlights barely reaching the edges of the lot. We stopped at the fence, checking it out before climbing over. It was old, rusted in places, but still held up enough to do its job. We knew where to go. There was a section where the bottom wire was loose enough to push down with a foot, making it easy to slip through. My friend went first, pressing the wire down and stepping over it like he had done 100 times before. I followed, careful not to catch my pants on the barbs. We didn't talk much, just moving fast, trying to get over before anyone saw us. Once we were in, we started walking toward the big dirt hill near the center of the lot. It was probably left over from some old construction work, just a massive pile of packed dirt and gravel, dry and loose from the heat of summer. We had climbed it before, but never this late. It felt different at night, taller somehow, the shadows stretching out around it, making it look like a mountain instead of just a pile of dirt. We started climbing, using our hands for balance, pushing up through the loose dirt. It was slow going, the ground slipping under our feet with every step. But eventually, we made it to the top. That's when we saw it. At first, it didn't register. It just looked like a mess of shapes in the dark, spread out below us, something that shouldn't have been there. Then, as our eyes adjusted, the shapes started forming into something more familiar. Tents. A lot of them. More than we could count at first. They were scattered across the field in a way that felt random, but organized at the same time, like they had been there for a while. Some looked newer, with bright-colored fabric still holding its shape, while others were sagging, worn down by weather and time. There were makeshift structures, too. Tarps stretched over wooden poles, stacks of old furniture, and even a few shopping carts filled with who knows what. It was a full-blown encampment. We immediately dropped down, pressing ourselves against the dirt, trying to stay as low as possible. Neither of us said a word, but we both knew the same thing. If someone saw us, it wouldn't be good. We stayed like that for a while, just watching. The camp was quiet, but not completely still. There were a few people moving around, their shapes barely visible in the dim light. A small fire flickered somewhere near the center, casting long shadows against the tents. We could hear muffled voices, the occasional sound of something metal clanking, and every now and then laughter, low and rough, like it belonged to people who hadn't laughed in a long time. Then, after what felt like forever, one of them stepped out. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with a scruffy ginger beard that caught the light from the fire. He was wearing an old, oversized jacket, torn in places, hanging loosely off his frame. He walked out of one of the tents, scratching his stomach, then turned away from the camp and started pissing right into the dirt. We didn't move, didn't breathe. If he turned around, if he looked up, he would see us. We were completely exposed on the ridge, nothing but open sky behind us. It wouldn't take much, a glance in the wrong direction, a stray noise, and we would be caught. We waited, feeling the seconds drag out, feeling our hearts pounding so hard we swore he could hear it. Then, just as he was finishing, something else happened. A sound, not from the camp, but from somewhere behind us. A low hum, then the faint crunch of tires on dirt. We turned our heads, just enough to see movement. A golf cart. It was coming from the other side of the lot, its headlights cutting through the darkness, a bright beam sweeping across the ground. And it wasn't empty. There were at least 3 people in it, sitting upright, focused, the one in the driver's seat steering while the guy next to him held something long in his hands. A pipe? A bat? It was hard to tell. But what was clear was the spotlight, mounted right on the front, casting a wide, glaring cone of light across the field as they moved. We pressed ourselves even flatter against the dirt, trying to make our bodies as small as possible. The cart kept coming, slow and steady, the light sweeping closer. Then it passed. We waited until it was a good distance away. Then we moved. Not fast, not yet. Just shifting, getting into a better position to go back down. That's when we heard the voice. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" It wasn't the ginger-bearded guy. It was one of the men from the cart, and he was coming toward us. We didn't stop to see how close he was. We just ran. The dirt gave way under our feet as we scrambled down the hill, sliding more than running, trying to stay upright. We could hear him behind us, his footsteps heavy, his breathing loud. We hit the bottom and didn't stop. The fence was ahead, maybe 20 yards away. We could hear him getting closer, hear his boots slamming against the ground, hear the anger in his breath. We reached the fence and didn't slow down. My friend went first, shoving down the wire, barely making it over before I followed, my leg catching for a split second, the barb snagging my jeans. I felt it tear, felt the sharp sting, but I didn't stop. We hit the other side and kept running. The street was ahead, the town just beyond that, safety so close we could feel it. Behind us, the man stopped. He didn't follow us through the fence. We didn't look back. We ran straight to my friend's house, slamming the door behind us, locking it, standing there, breathing hard, listening. But there was nothing. No footsteps. No voices. Just silence. We didn't go back to that lot again. I had always thought my friend's house was creepy. It wasn't the kind of house that felt welcoming when you stepped inside. It was old, a century old at least, and it looked the part. The floors creaked under your weight no matter how lightly you walked. The walls had a way of absorbing sound, so that the house always felt too quiet. And the attic, God, the attic, was the worst part. It was a 3-story house, built in a way that made no real sense. The first floor was the living area, the kitchen, and the dining room, all laid out in a cramped, almost suffocating way that made it feel smaller than it should have. The second floor had all the bedrooms, including hers, which was bigger than the others, but not in a comfortable way. It felt like it had been an afterthought, like the builders had realized last minute they needed an extra room and just carved one out of the house. But the third floor was the attic, and no matter how many times I went over, I never felt comfortable knowing it was above us. Her bedroom had this weird little storage closet right above her bed. It wasn't like a normal closet, more like a hole in the wall with a wooden door, just big enough for someone to crawl through if they really wanted to. She used it for storage, mostly old toys and clothes, but every time I looked at it, it felt wrong, like it didn't belong there. She had always told me the house was haunted, not in a fun horror movie way, but in a way that made her uneasy living there. She would say she thought she had a guardian angel watching over her, but the stories she told never sounded like anything protective to me. They were unsettling. They made my stomach knot up, made me feel like if I spent too much time there, I'd end up noticing something I didn't want to. One night, we were hanging out in her room like we always did, and we started talking about the house again. I liked asking about the creepy things that happened, partly because I was curious, but mostly because I wanted to see if there was something I could explain. I wanted to believe there was a reason for it all. She told me about a night when she had woken up to the sound of an old toy playing in her closet. It wasn't an electronic toy or something that could have just malfunctioned. It was one of those wind-up toys that slowly spun while playing music, the kind that shouldn't move unless someone had physically touched it. She said she had frozen in bed, just listening as the tinny mechanical sound played from inside the closet. She waited for it to stop, hoping she had imagined it, but then it started again. She got up, climbed onto her bed, and tried to reach into the closet to stop it, but she couldn't get to it. After a few minutes, it just stopped on its own. I tried to act like it wasn't a big deal, but I could feel my skin crawling. It wasn't the only time something like that had happened to her. Her pets, 2 cats and a dog, had a habit of staring at one specific corner of her bedroom. They never did it individually either. It was always all 3 of them at once, like something had caught their attention that she and I couldn't see. The weirdest part, though, was the recordings. We had left my phone recording in the attic a couple of times, just out of curiosity. The first time we did it, we had been the only ones on the second floor. Her dad was asleep on the couch downstairs, and the house was otherwise silent. When we played the recording back, we heard it, clear as day, a voice saying her name. It was a woman's voice, sharp and quick, almost like someone calling out to get her attention. But her mom wasn't home. We played it over and over again, trying to find some other explanation, but there wasn't one. We also caught other things, sneezing, coughing, footsteps moving around. Things shifting, like objects being pushed or knocked over. But when we went up to check, nothing had moved. The house was wrong. We tried recording a video once, but we didn't catch much. Just the usual creaking, the uncomfortable silence, the occasional sound that didn't belong. I didn't stop going over to her house, though. As much as it creeped me out, I wanted to keep trying. I wanted to see if we could get something undeniable, something we could show other people that would prove it wasn't just in our heads. But I stopped after the last time. It was late, later than we usually stayed up. We were in her room, scrolling through our phones, waiting for something to happen. We had left my phone recording in the attic again, and this time, we had left hers in the hallway on the second floor, just to see if we could catch anything different. We sat there for almost an hour, listening to the quiet. Nothing. Eventually, we got tired and decided to check the recordings. We started with my phone. At first, it was just normal attic sounds, the occasional creak of the house settling, a faint rustling that could have been anything. Then out of nowhere, there was a noise that made both of us stop. It was a thump, a heavy, deliberate thump, like something had dropped or been pushed over. Then footsteps. They weren't loud, but they were clear. Slow, steady, moving across the attic floor. They stopped for a few seconds, and then, a breath. It was close to the microphone, too close. It was deep, almost like a sigh. Then silence. We looked at each other, both of us wide-eyed, neither of us saying a word. Then we played her phone's recording. For the first few minutes, there was nothing. Then the same thump, the same footsteps. But this time, they weren't coming from the attic. They were coming from the hallway, right outside her bedroom door. And then, the doorknob rattled. Not once, not twice, but over and over again, like someone was trying to turn it, trying to get in. But we hadn't heard it in real time. We had been awake, sitting in the same room, and we hadn't heard a single sound. I don't know how long we sat there, staring at each other, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. I left not long after that. I still see her, but I don't go to her house anymore. Not because I think it's haunted, not because I'm scared of ghosts, but because I can't explain what happened. And that's worse. The house in Iowa where my sister lived wasn't particularly old, but it had that slightly worn, lived-in feel that seemed to collect memories in corners. When I came down from Minnesota to stay for a while, I was 6 months pregnant with my second child, and it felt like the right time to visit. The trip was supposed to be relaxing, a nice break from the hustle and bustle, and to spend some time with my sister and her young daughter. She had a spare room that she'd set up as both a library and a nursery, a room tucked off her own bedroom, which she had graciously given to my daughter and me for our stay. The room itself was a bit strange. At first glance, it seemed like a cozy space, with bookshelves lining the walls, filled with children's stories and well-worn novels, but there was something off about it. Maybe it was the layout, almost like an attic, with the sloped ceilings that made the room feel smaller than it actually was. The center of the room was the tallest part, but the sides sloped down at a steep angle, and the ceiling met the walls in a way that made the space feel claustrophobic. The most striking feature, though, was the huge picture window at the far end. It stretched across the wall like an open invitation to the night outside. From where the bed was, you could see the streetlights outlining the darkened yard, a stark contrast to the otherwise dimly lit room. That night, after we'd settled in, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling the room gave me. Maybe it was the strange angle of the ceiling, or maybe it was the way the wind would rustle the trees outside, but something about that space made me feel on edge. My daughter, 5 years old at the time, had already curled up beside me on the air mattress. I was trying to get comfortable with my growing belly, but it wasn't easy. The baby had been kicking up a storm, more active than usual, and I was doing my best not to disturb my daughter. She was such a light sleeper, and the last thing I wanted was to wake her up with all the movement. I tried to adjust myself slowly, being careful not to make any noise, but it was hard with the squeaky air mattress beneath us. After a while, I felt myself drift into a half-sleep, the kind of sleep where you're never fully asleep, but not quite awake either. It was during that restless sleep that I felt my daughter shift behind me. At first, I thought she was just adjusting, maybe turning over in her sleep. But then I noticed that she wasn't there anymore. The bed was small, and we'd both been pressed together to fit. When I couldn't feel her warmth behind me anymore, I instinctively reached back to pat her, to make sure she hadn't rolled off the bed or shifted too far. There was nothing. My heart skipped a beat. I could hear the soft hum of the night, the distant sound of the wind rustling outside, but I couldn't hear her breathing or feel her presence next to me. I shifted my weight and awkwardly lifted myself up, trying to find her in the dim light. I peered over the side of the air mattress, scanning the small space. There was no sign of her. Then I froze. She was standing, not next to me, but in front of the large picture window at the far end of the room. The faint light from the streetlights outside illuminated her small frame, casting her shadow across the floor. She was just standing there, facing the window, not moving. My blood ran cold. "Come back to bed," I whispered, trying not to disturb my sister in the next room. I didn't want to alarm her, but I needed to get my daughter back to bed before something worse happened. I could hear my daughter let out a soft, almost exasperated sigh, as if she was tired of my constant instructions. She didn't move. Then, before I could react, she jumped. I couldn't even process it at first. The movement was so fast. 1 second, she was standing there. The next second, she was hurtling through the air. Through the window. I heard it, the sound of glass shattering, the unmistakable crunch of it as the window shattered into pieces. It felt like everything froze for a moment. The world around me was silent. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't breathe. My mind couldn't catch up with what I had just witnessed. She had jumped. She had gone right through the window. I threw myself off the bed, panic flooding my body. I stumbled toward the window, looking for any sign of her, expecting to find her lying on the ground below, broken, hurt. But the room felt so still, too still. My breath was coming in shallow gasps as I slowly moved toward the broken glass. My hands were shaking, and I could feel my body trembling from head to toe. But as I got closer, I looked down at the bed. There she was, sleeping soundly. No glass, no shattered window. No sign of the jump. It was as if nothing had happened at all. I stood there in shock, staring at her for what felt like an eternity. My chest tightened, and I could barely catch my breath. My legs were unsteady, and I had to grip the edge of the bed to steady myself. I had seen her jump. I had heard the glass break. But now, she was just lying there, completely unaware of what had just happened. It took me a few moments to gather myself. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. I had no idea what was going on, but I knew one thing for sure. Something was wrong. I was starting to feel like I was losing control of my thoughts, like I was caught in some sort of strange dream or hallucination. I reached down and gently shook my daughter's shoulder, waking her up. She stirred, blinking sleepily as she rubbed her eyes. "Mom," she mumbled, still half asleep. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice shaking, though I was trying to stay calm. She nodded, still drowsy. "I'm fine." I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to explain what had just happened. The glass breaking, her jumping through the window. It was all too much to process. But I could feel the panic rising again, like a tidal wave. My body was still trembling, my heart still racing, and I didn't know if I could handle another moment in that room. I stood there for a while, just staring at her, trying to make sense of it. My mind raced through every possibility. Was it a dream? A hallucination? Some strange trick of my pregnancy hormones? I couldn't make sense of it, but the fear and confusion were all too real. I felt a cold sweat forming on my skin, and I wanted nothing more than to get out of that room. Finally, I lay back down, my daughter beside me, and I closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. The fear lingered, creeping into the edges of my thoughts, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I had to convince myself it was just a bad dream, that it wasn't real. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my sister in the next room, moving about the house. I sat up, looking over at my daughter, who was still curled up next to me, peacefully sleeping. The room felt different now, quieter, almost too calm. The sunlight streaming through the picture window only made it feel more normal, but I couldn't shake the unease that still clung to me. I got up slowly, my limbs feeling heavy, and walked over to the broken window. It was just as I remembered it, shattered glass all over the floor. But there was no sign of the jump, no sign of my daughter outside. I cleaned up the glass as best as I could, trying to push away the lingering dread. It wasn't until much later, after I had spent the rest of the day in a haze, trying to focus on anything other than the night before, that I began to piece together the truth. It was all just a nightmare. The broken window, the jump, everything. It had all been in my head, but it didn't feel like that. The memory of it was so vivid, so real. And I couldn't forget that overwhelming sense of dread I felt when I saw my daughter standing in front of that window. Even now, years later, I still don't know what really happened that night. All I know is that it felt like something had broken inside me that I couldn't repair. I've always been sensitive to things. Growing up, I saw things most people didn't, but I didn't know what to make of it. My childhood memories are mixed with strange figures, shadows, and strange occurrences that I thought were just part of being a kid. At first, I thought everyone saw them, but as I got older, I realized how wrong I was. I don't know what it was, ghosts, spirits, or something else, but I saw them. I don't know when it started, but I'd wake up in the middle of the night and see a figure standing by my bed. It wasn't solid like a person, it was more like a shadow, and it would be standing just out of the corner of my eye. Sometimes it would move, and I'd catch glimpses of it out of the corner of my vision. It was the kind of thing that made you freeze in place, too afraid to blink, too afraid to look directly at it, because once you did, it would disappear. But there were times when I'd see them so clearly that it didn't feel like a hallucination. It was a presence, something there. I couldn't explain it, but it was real. As I grew older, I learned about sleep paralysis, and that maybe these were just symptoms of that, some kind of hallucination or dreamlike state where my body was awake, but my mind wasn't. But it didn't always feel like that. Some of the time, I would be fully awake, standing, walking around, doing something normal, and still, I'd see the figures. The most vivid memory I have was at my girlfriend's house. I had never really thought much about it at the time, but looking back, I wonder if that's when everything started to change. Her house wasn't anything special. It was a small, two-story place with a winding staircase in the hallway and a couple of rooms off to the side. The walls were bare, and there were a lot of windows, so the sun would shine through during the day. But at night, when it got dark, something else seemed to happen. At first, I noticed it only out of the corner of my eye, shadows moving through the hallway, figures standing in the doorway for a split second, then disappearing. It wasn't enough to make me panic, but it was enough to keep me on edge. It felt like being watched, like someone was there, standing just behind me or just out of view. Then, one evening, it happened more clearly. I was sitting on the couch, half watching TV while my girlfriend was upstairs getting something. I glanced toward the staircase and saw something moving. A shadowy figure, stumbling down the stairs. It didn't move like a person. It was more like it was dragging itself down, crippled or hurt. It had a weird lurch to it, like something was wrong with its body. I froze. The figure kept coming down slowly, carefully, and it stopped just short of the bottom. It turned. At first, I thought I was just imagining it, but then I realized it had turned to look right at me. And it wasn't like a ghost from a horror movie. It was something real. It had eyes, clear as day, even in the dim lighting. I could see them, black, empty, staring into mine. I couldn't look away. The air in the room grew heavy, like I was holding my breath, even though I hadn't realized I was doing it. It didn't move for a long time, just standing there, looking at me. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't know what to do. It felt like my whole body was frozen, like if I moved, it would disappear. Or worse, if I blinked, it would come closer. The dog was the one to break me out of it. He ran into the room, skittering across the floor with his tail between his legs. He noticed the thing too, and without a second thought, he turned and bolted out of the room, disappearing into the hallway. That's when I snapped out of it. I stood up, walked slowly toward the stairs, but by the time I got there, it was gone. The figure, whatever it was, had vanished. I was left standing in the hallway, shaking, trying to tell myself it wasn't real. But I knew it was. I wasn't hallucinating. It was too real, too solid. I wasn't imagining it. The next time I saw it, I was more prepared. I had learned something when I was younger, a trick I used to make the figures go away. When I was a kid, I had a recurring nightmare where I'd wake up in the middle of the night and see something standing by my door. It was terrifying, but I discovered that if I stared at it long enough, forced myself to concentrate, it would disappear. Like I could turn off whatever part of me was seeing it. It wasn't easy, but I found that focusing on it with everything I had would make it vanish. And it worked. Sometimes. So, when the figure appeared again, standing right in the middle of the living room, I didn't freeze. I focused. I stared at it, willing it to go away. The figure didn't move at first, but then, as I concentrated harder, it slowly turned toward me. And as it looked at me, it began to fade. The shadowy edges of it blurred, and in a few moments it was gone. But that wasn't the end of it. The next time I saw it, I was alone in the house. My girlfriend had stepped out to run errands, and I was just picking up a few things for her. It was a typical day, bright and sunny, peaceful. I walked into the living room, and there it was, standing, right in the middle of the room, just like before. I tried focusing again, like I had last time. I stared at it, trying to make it disappear. And for a moment, it worked. The figure turned toward me, like it knew I was doing something. But this time, it didn't fade all the way. It stayed, lingering in my vision, only to reappear even more clearly, standing just behind me. It wasn't gone, not completely. It was still there, and now it felt closer, like it was waiting for me to look away. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to turn, but I couldn't look at it directly. I didn't want to. The fear was too much. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I could get rid of it again. From that point on, I could feel it when I was in the house. It wasn't always visible, but it was there, watching, breathing down my neck. Every time I turned around, I could feel it standing behind me. I couldn't get rid of it like before. It was too persistent. And worse, every time my girlfriend's best friend came over, she would notice it too. She would look at me with a weird expression and ask, "What's behind you?" I couldn't explain it to her. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I knew she saw it. She had seen it before, long before I even came into the picture. She had never mentioned it to me, but now we were both seeing it. And that was worse, knowing it wasn't just me, that others could see it too. It wasn't some figment of my imagination. It was real. But what really made it worse was that it didn't show up in pictures. No digital cameras, no Polaroids, nothing. I tried taking pictures every time I saw it, just to prove to myself that I wasn't crazy. But every time I looked at the photo, it wasn't there. Nothing showed up. It was like it was purposefully avoiding being captured. My girlfriend thought I was just being paranoid. She didn't believe me when I said something was wrong with the house. She thought I just didn't like staying over there, that maybe I was uncomfortable being around her friends or the house itself. But that wasn't it. It wasn't about the house. It was about that thing. It would stand behind me, quietly, always just out of view. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make it go away completely. I didn't know what to do anymore. I hated being alone in the house, but I couldn't bring myself to leave either. It felt like I was trapped. I never told my girlfriend the full truth, but I had to stop going over there alone. I couldn't handle it. And then one day, I didn't see it at all. It was like it just vanished. After months of it lingering in the background, breathing down my neck, it was gone. I don't know what happened. Maybe it got bored, maybe it moved on, or maybe I did something unknowingly to make it leave. But I never saw it again. I still don't know what it was. I don't know if it was a ghost, a spirit, or just something I was imagining, but I learned to live with it. Or at least I learned to ignore it when it reappeared. I don't see it anymore. Not like I used to. But sometimes, when I'm alone in a room, I'll feel a presence behind me. And I can't help but wonder, what if it's still there, just waiting for the right moment to show up again? When I was 12, my best friend and I were the kind of kids who couldn't sit still. We lived in a small town in Wisconsin, the kind of place where summer days stretched on forever, and there wasn't much to do unless you went looking for trouble. We didn't have phones or anything back then, so our entertainment came from whatever we could find. That usually meant riding our bikes around town, exploring places we weren't supposed to be, and seeing what we could get away with. It wasn't anything too serious, just harmless mischief, at least in our eyes. That summer, we had already climbed to the top of the old water tower, raced our bikes down the steepest hill in town until our brakes almost caught fire, and tried to camp out in the woods overnight before chickening out and riding home at 2 in the morning. But the most exciting thing we did, the one thing that still sticks with me to this day, was the night we broke into that warehouse. My friend was the one who brought it up. He had heard from his older brother that there was this abandoned warehouse on the edge of town, just past the old train tracks. It used to be a distribution center for one of those cheap dollar stores, but the company had gone under, and now the building was just sitting there, filled with unsold merchandise. According to him, nobody really watched over the place, and the locks were easy to get past if you knew what you were doing. The idea of breaking into an actual building made me nervous, but I wasn't about to back down. We had snuck into plenty of places before, old barns, empty houses that were for sale, even the junkyard on the outskirts of town. But this was different. This was an actual business, a real crime. But he made it sound easy, and I didn't want to be the one to chicken out. We waited until just before sunset before heading over. It was early enough that it wouldn't be suspicious for us to be out on our bikes, but late enough that we could hopefully avoid running into anyone. The warehouse was a big, ugly metal building with a long loading dock and a few small office windows near the top. The front doors were locked, but my friend had a plan. There was a small, broken window near the back, just big enough for us to squeeze through. He had found it earlier that week when he was scoping the place out, and now he was ready to show me. He went first, hoisting himself up and sliding through with ease. I followed right after, feeling the jagged glass scrape against my arm as I wriggled my way inside. The inside of the warehouse was dark, the only light coming from the dirty skylights above. Rows of metal shelves stretched out in every direction, stacked high with boxes covered in dust. The air was thick and musty, like old cardboard and stale candy. It was completely silent, except for the occasional creak of the metal roof shifting in the evening heat. We started exploring right away. Most of the boxes were filled with cheap junk, plastic toys, cheap kitchen utensils, off-brand cleaning supplies, but then we found the good stuff. A whole section filled with candy, bags of it stacked from floor to ceiling. We tore into a box and grabbed a handful of Laffy Taffy, stuffing pieces into our pockets and mouths as we laughed at how easy this all was. Then we found the fake jewelry. Gold-colored rings, plastic necklaces, watches that looked expensive but probably didn't even work. We piled them into our hands, stuffing our pockets like we had just hit the jackpot. We weren't thinking about what we'd do with it all. We were just caught up in the thrill of it. And that's when we heard the door open. The heavy metal door at the front of the warehouse groaned as it swung open, echoing through the empty space. The sound of footsteps followed, slow and deliberate. Someone was inside. We froze. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My friend looked at me, his eyes wide, and whispered one word: hide. He moved first, slipping behind the door of a small side room filled with even more boxes. I turned to follow, but there wasn't enough space for both of us. Panic set in as I looked around for another hiding spot. That's when I saw the closet. It was small, more of a storage nook than a real closet, with no door and barely enough room to crouch inside. It wasn't a great hiding spot, but it was the only thing I had. I ducked inside just as the voices got closer. Two men walked into the room, their voices low but clear. "Somebody's been in here," one of them said. "Yeah, I know," the other replied. "Little shits keep breaking in. If I ever catch them, I'm gonna beat the hell out of them." I stopped breathing. I was shaking so bad I thought for sure they would hear me. I pressed myself into the corner of the closet, trying to disappear into the shadows. The men started rummaging through the boxes, shuffling things around as they talked. They weren't in a hurry. They weren't just checking the place. They were looking for someone. Every second felt like an hour. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, feel the sweat dripping down my back. I tried to take slow, quiet breaths, but I felt like I couldn't get enough air. Then one of them moved closer to my hiding spot. He was only a few feet away now, close enough that I could see his boots under the dim light. He stopped, looking around like he sensed something wasn't right. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying he wouldn't take one more step. And then just like that, he turned and walked away. "Let's get out of here," the other guy said. "We'll check again tomorrow." The door creaked open, then slammed shut. Silence. I stayed frozen, too scared to move. I didn't trust that they were really gone. I kept listening, waiting for footsteps to come back, for the door to open again. Finally, my friend peeked out from behind the door. He looked at me, his face pale, and I knew he had been just as scared as I was. Neither of us said a word. We just stood there, waiting, listening. Then, finally, we moved. We crept out of the storage room, stepping as quietly as possible. My legs felt weak, my whole body buzzing with adrenaline. We retraced our steps back to the broken window, climbed through, and dropped down onto the pavement outside. The moment our feet hit the ground, we ran. We didn't stop until we reached our bikes. We jumped on, pedaling as fast as we could, the warm summer air rushing past us as we tore through the empty streets. My heart was still pounding, but the fear was turning into something else now, relief. We had gotten away. We didn't talk much on the way home. There wasn't anything to say. We both knew how close we had come to getting caught, and we weren't about to press our luck again. That was the first and last time I ever broke into a building. I never told my parents, never mentioned it to anyone. The fear of getting caught, of what could have happened if those men had found us, was enough to keep me from ever doing anything that stupid again. But I still remember that night like it was yesterday. And I still remember the taste of that Laffy Taffy, the kind with the sprinkles. I went to the Chengdu Panda Park this summer, while in China. It wasn't really planned. My parents were in a meeting with some government official, and my tour guide had some free time, so we decided to check it out. The park was basically a zoo, except it only had pandas, both the giant ones and the red ones. It was hot, humid, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and greenery, and there were a lot of tourists moving around with cameras, sun hats, and fans. I wasn't overly excited about it, but it beat sitting in some hotel lobby waiting for my parents to finish whatever business they had. My guide, a woman in her mid-20s, was fit and looked like the type who spent a lot of time outdoors. She was leading the way, pointing out different parts of the park, explaining things about pandas that I only half listened to. I was mostly just taking in the scenery. The trees were thick, the paths curved through lush greenery, and the enclosures were spacious. The whole place had a kind of peaceful, lazy vibe to it. I noticed him for the first time near one of the giant panda enclosures. He stood out. A middle-aged man, maybe in his late 40s or early 50s, wearing a beige trench coat. It was an odd choice given the weather, long, heavy, like something out of an old detective movie. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and he had thin, stringy hair slicked back over his scalp. He was holding a black umbrella, open, even though there was no rain. That itself wasn't too weird. Lots of people used umbrellas in China to block the sun, but something about the way he stood there, just outside the crowd watching, felt off. He wasn't looking at the pandas. He wasn't looking at the other tourists. He was looking at us. At first, I thought maybe he was just staring off into space, not really seeing anything. Some people zone out, especially in places like this, just killing time. But when we moved, he moved. Not immediately, not in an obvious way, but always keeping the same distance, just at the edge of where I could see him. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching us. We walked through different sections of the park, stopping to look at enclosures, watching pandas eat, sleep, climb. Every now and then, I would glance around, and he would be there, always at a distance, always in the shade, always with the black umbrella open. Whenever he passed through a sunlit area, he would lower it slightly, his fingers gripping the handle tightly, then snap it open again as soon as he stepped into the shade. It was strange. The way he walked, the way he moved, slow, deliberate, careful. His eyes flicked to me every time I turned around, like he was waiting for something. His expression never changed. It wasn't blank, but it wasn't friendly either. The best way I could describe it was a smirk, but not a normal one. It was the kind of look that made my skin crawl, like he knew something I didn't, like he was amused by something only he understood. I kept an eye on him as we made our way deeper into the park. My guide didn't seem to notice. She was too focused on showing me around, making sure I got the full experience. I didn't want to say anything and sound paranoid, especially since the guy didn't seem like much of a threat. He was thin, frail-looking, not someone who could overpower either of us if it came down to it. Still, something about him put me on edge. The path leading to the red panda section was quieter than the others. Fewer people, more trees, a winding trail that curved through a shaded area. As we reached the turn, I looked ahead and stopped. He was there, standing at the end of the path, umbrella open, directly in our way. There was nothing outwardly threatening about it. He wasn't blocking the path aggressively. He wasn't approaching us, but the way he stood there, waiting, made my stomach twist. The umbrella cast a shadow over his face, but I could still see the smirk. The park was mostly silent in this area. No chattering tourists, no kids running around, just the distant rustling of leaves and the occasional sound of birds. My guide kept walking, oblivious, and I forced myself to follow, keeping my eyes on him. As we got closer, he didn't move. He didn't step aside, didn't shift his weight, just stood completely still, watching. Then, right as we passed him, he turned his head slightly, looking directly at me, and smiled. His teeth were sharp, not just crooked or yellowed, sharp, jagged, like they had been filed down. I kept walking, my pulse hammering in my ears, refusing to look back. My guide was still talking, still unaware of anything unusual, but I couldn't focus on her words anymore. My skin felt too tight, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. He was still following us. Not closely, not in an obvious way, but every time I glanced back, I saw him. The umbrella bobbing slightly as he walked, the smirk never leaving his face. For the rest of our time in the park, he was there. Always just far enough away to not be a direct threat, but never out of sight. The pattern continued, the umbrella opening and closing whenever he moved through sunlight, the slow, measured steps, the way he watched me with that same unsettling smile. When we finally left the park, stepping onto the sidewalk outside the entrance, I turned around one last time. He was standing just beyond the gate. He nodded at me. Then he grinned again, wide enough this time that I could see all of his teeth. I turned away and walked to the car, my body tense, my mind racing. My guide was still cheerful, still talking about the pandas, completely unaware of the entire thing. I didn't say anything. What could I have said? That some weird guy had been watching us? That he had freaky teeth? That I didn't know what he wanted? But I knew I didn't want to find out. I looked out the window as we drove away, scanning the sidewalk, the entrance, the street beyond. He was gone. I never saw him again, but I still think about him. The way he moved, the way he watched, the way he smiled, and the way I still don't know what he wanted. The trip was supposed to be perfect. A week in the Bahamas, staying in a beautiful resort right by the beach, sunbathing, drinking fruity cocktails, and escaping the stress of high school. It was a family vacation, but bringing a friend made it way better. There was no one to babysit us, no strict rules to follow, just a chance to have fun. The beach was like something out of a dream. Bright turquoise water, soft white sand, the kind of place people put on postcards. All along the shore, locals had set up little stands selling everything you could think of: braided hair, handmade jewelry, conch shells, and if you knew who to ask, other things too. People walked by, haggling, handing over money, disappearing with whatever they wanted. Some guys were offering jet ski rides, and that's where it all started. He was young, maybe early 20s, dark skin, clean-shaven, good-looking, and way too charming for his own good. He had one of those easygoing island accents, but he spoke English fluently. He came up to us with a grin, asking if we wanted to ride a jet ski. It was expensive, $150 for an hour, but then he smiled and said we could go for free. Who wouldn't say yes to that? We climbed onto the back of the jet ski, the salty air whipping against our faces as we tore across the water. It was exhilarating, skimming across the waves, watching the resort shrink in the distance. We held on tight, laughing as we bounced over the swells. He was in control, steering us exactly where he wanted to go, and we didn't think to question it. After a while, he turned slightly and shouted over the roar of the engine. Did we like to smoke? It was an easy answer. Of course we did. He grinned and told us there was a party on another island, not far away. Beer, weed, good music. Just a short ride across the water. We looked where he pointed, at a stretch of land rising up out of the ocean. Nothing but trees and sand. It looked empty, but we were high, carefree, stupid. It sounded exciting, like an adventure. No one ever tells you how quickly a dream can turn into a nightmare. The ride was longer than we expected. The resort, the tourists, all of it faded behind us. The beach was a distant strip of color, getting smaller and smaller. We weren't paying attention at first, just enjoying the ride, but slowly, a sinking feeling set in. It was too far. We were completely alone. The ocean stretched in every direction, nothing but endless blue. The realization hit, and suddenly the jet ski didn't feel so fun anymore. When we reached the shore, it was quiet. No music, no laughter, no signs of a party. Just 5 or 6 men sitting around a barbecue pit, speaking in a language we didn't understand. They weren't young and friendly like the guy who brought us. They were older, late 30s, maybe 40s. Their expressions were unreadable as they looked at us, their voices dropping lower as they muttered to each other. Something was wrong. The air felt heavy, thick with something unspoken. Their eyes moved over us, up and down, slow and deliberate. The easy smiles were gone. There was no welcome, no offer of a drink or a joint. Just silence. Their quiet conversation, the way they studied us, made my stomach turn. I felt exposed, like prey. I could hear the ocean behind me, the waves crashing against the shore, but the water wasn't an escape. We were trapped. No one knew where we were. No one could hear us scream. I gripped my phone, my fingers shaking. The lock screen glowed back at me. No service. My friend glanced at me, her face pale, her hands twitching like she didn't know what to do with them. She felt it too. The sick realization. This wasn't a party. I pressed the phone to my ear anyway, pretending to answer a call. My voice shook, but I forced it to sound steady. I said my mom's name, acted annoyed, then changed my tone, making it sound like she was panicking. I told her to calm down, told her I was fine, that she didn't need to call the police. That word, police, changed everything. The men stiffened. The low murmurs turned sharp, clipped. The man who had brought us turned, speaking quickly to them in their language. I could see the shift, the sudden unease in their faces. It was a gamble, but it worked. No one wanted the trouble. He grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the jet ski. I didn't argue. We climbed on fast, the engine roaring to life. The moment we hit the water, I exhaled, my chest tight with fear. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if they were still watching. The ride back was fast, tense. No more grins, no more charm. He barely spoke. When we reached the beach, we scrambled off, our legs shaking as we hit the sand. I turned to say something, but he was already gone, the jet ski slicing through the water, heading far away from us. For the rest of the trip, we didn't see him again. He was gone, vanished like he had never existed. We never told our parents, never told anyone, but I can still feel it, The weight of their stares, the cold silence, the way my gut twisted with the realization that we were never supposed to leave that island. I remember that night clearly, even though it's been over a decade. It was one of those evenings that felt normal in every way, until suddenly it wasn't. I was in high school at the time, maybe 16 or 17, and I had volunteered with a friend to help watch kids at a local church's daycare. It was something we had done before, nothing unusual about it. The church held an evening service, and sometimes after the service, there would be a dinner or some kind of gathering. Parents would leave their kids with us while they attended, and we'd keep them entertained until it was time to go home. The daycare was made up of 2 connected rooms. One was the snack room, which had a small kitchenette, a few child-sized tables, and cabinets filled with juice boxes and crackers. The other was the playroom, a larger space filled with toys, books, and tiny chairs. A single doorway connected the 2 rooms, no door, just an open space leading from one to the other. It was a routine setup. Kids would come in, have their snacks, then head into the playroom while we cleaned up before joining them. That night, everything was running as usual. My friend, the other volunteer, took the kids into the playroom after they finished their snacks, and I stayed behind to clean up. It wasn't much, just wiping down tables, picking up dropped crackers, and rinsing out cups in the sink. One little girl, maybe 3 or 4 years old, stayed behind with me. She had been slow to finish her snack, so I gave her an extra cracker to keep her occupied while I cleaned. She was a quiet kid, small with wispy blonde hair, wearing one of those oversized church dresses that made it look like she was swimming in fabric. She sat at the table, nibbling on her cracker, swinging her legs beneath her chair. I heard her murmuring to herself as I wiped down the counter. That wasn't unusual. Kids talk to themselves all the time. Maybe she was pretending, acting out some little story in her head. I didn't think much of it. I kept working, moving around the room, listening to the soft sounds of the kids playing in the other room. The playroom was loud laughter, high-pitched shrieks, toys clattering against the floor. The snack room, in contrast, was quiet except for the girl's soft voice. I was on autopilot, focused on getting everything cleaned up quickly so I could rejoin my friend in the playroom. Then, out of nowhere, she started crying. Not just a small whimper or a sniffle, the kind of crying that instantly grabs your attention. Huge, gasping sobs, her tiny shoulders shaking as tears streamed down her face. Cracker crumbs spilled from her mouth as she cried, falling onto the front of her dress. It was sudden, completely out of nowhere. 1 second, she was fine, murmuring to herself, eating her cracker, and the next, she was breaking down like something had just crushed her world. I dropped the dish towel in my hand and rushed to her side, scooping her up instinctively. She clung to me, her little hands gripping my shirt, face pressed into my shoulder as she sobbed. My first thought was that she had hurt herself, maybe bit her tongue or got a stomachache. I pulled back slightly, trying to check her mouth, but nothing seemed wrong. No blood, no signs of pain, just tears and frantic, shuddering breaths. I held her, trying to calm her down, rubbing her back as she continued to cry. I asked her what was wrong. Between her hiccuping sobs, she managed to get out a few words, barely understandable through her tears. "That boy won't stop picking on me." I froze for a second. I glanced around the room automatically, but it was empty. The only boy in the room was in her imagination. At first, I thought she was talking about one of the other kids. Maybe she had been playing with someone earlier, and she was just now upset about something that had happened. I glanced toward the playroom, where I could hear the other children laughing and playing, completely unaware of what was happening in the snack room. I turned back to her, still holding her in my arms, still feeling the shuddering rise and fall of her small chest against mine. "What boy?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. She lifted her tiny arm, fingers trembling, and pointed to the far corner of the room. I followed her gaze. The corner was empty. Just a section of beige-painted wall, a small shelf filled with plastic bins of extra toys, and nothing else. Nothing at all. But she wasn't just pointing. She was staring, her face twisted with fear, her tiny hands gripping my shirt even tighter. Something about the way she was looking at that corner sent a chill through me. I didn't hesitate. I turned, carrying her into the playroom, my heart pounding faster than I wanted to admit. The second we stepped into the brighter, livelier space, she calmed a little, her sobs slowing into soft sniffles. I sat her down near my friend, who gave me a confused look. I didn't explain. I just turned back toward the snack room, staring at the empty space I had just left. The room looked the same as always, benign, silent, nothing unusual. But standing there in the doorway, I felt something. A tension in the air, like the weight of an unspoken presence pressing down on my shoulders. I swallowed hard and walked back inside. I didn't know what I was expecting to see. Maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that nothing was there, that the girl had been imagining things, that I wasn't being ridiculous. But I couldn't shake the way she had looked at that corner. I stayed in the snack room for a few more minutes, finishing up my cleaning, but my nerves were shot. Every small sound made me twitch: the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock on the wall, the faint voices of the kids playing next door. When I finally turned off the lights and left the room, I felt relief wash over me. The rest of the night went by normally. The kids played, parents came to pick them up one by one, and soon it was just my friend and me, waiting for the last few stragglers. The little girl had calmed down completely by then, as if nothing had ever happened. I didn't bring it up again. I didn't ask her any more questions. But as I stood near the exit, waiting for the final kids to leave, I glanced back toward the snack room one last time. The lights were off, the room dark and still. But that uneasy feeling remained. And even though I knew it was empty, I couldn't help but feel like something was still in there, watching. My mom has always been the kind of person who notices things. Little details that don't seem to matter at first, but build into something that lingers in the back of your mind. When she told me this story, she wasn't trying to scare me. She wasn't the kind of person who made up ghost stories or exaggerated things to make them sound more exciting than they were. She just told me what happened, as plainly as she could. And every time she brings it up, I can tell that, even now, it unsettles her. This happened when I was a baby, still small enough to sleep in a crib, still young enough that I couldn't really form memories of my own yet. My parents were living in a small apartment at the time, a cheap but decent place in a quiet neighborhood. My dad was working long hours, so for most of the day, it was just me and my mom. She had a routine. She would clean, do laundry, cook, and take care of me. She liked to keep the apartment neat. She wasn't obsessive about it, but she wasn't the type to let things get messy for long. The apartment wasn't anything special. It had one bedroom, a small living room, a kitchen, and a tiny laundry room off to the side. My crib was set up in my parents' bedroom, right next to my mom's side of the bed. She liked having me close so she could check on me during the night. During the day, she would set me in the crib while she did chores. Sometimes I napped, sometimes I stayed awake and played with whatever toys were in there with me. I was a restless baby, always moving, crawling, grabbing things. My mom said she would peek in before heading to the laundry room and see me sitting up, playing, babbling to myself. She would leave me like that and go do whatever needed to be done. And then, when she came back, I would be asleep. Not just asleep, perfectly tucked in. My blanket would be neatly arranged over me, the way an adult would do it. My little stuffed bear, which I usually tossed around or clutched in my hand, would be sitting upright next to me. The crib, which should have had some sign of my usual movement, rumpled blankets, shifted pillows, was neat. The first time she noticed it, she didn't think much of it. Babies fall asleep all the time. Maybe I had just worn myself out and happened to fall asleep in the same position I had been placed in earlier. Maybe she had simply imagined that the blanket had been Messier before. But then it kept happening. Every single time she left me alone for more than a few minutes, she would come back to find the same thing. I would be asleep, tucked in, the crib arranged in a way that seemed deliberate. Too deliberate. She tested it a few times, just to be sure. She would watch me from the doorway before leaving. She would see me moving, playing. And then, a few minutes later, I would be still, quiet, tucked in neatly. It made no sense. She started to feel uneasy. My dad was at work during the day. The apartment was locked. No one else had a key. There was no reason why things should be changing when she wasn't in the room. She told my dad about it that evening. He dismissed it, said she was overthinking it, said babies did weird things sometimes. Maybe I had figured out how to pull the blanket over myself. Maybe she just didn't remember how she had left things before going to do laundry. But she knew. She knew how she had left me. She knew a baby my age wouldn't be able to tuck themselves in that neatly, wouldn't be able to place a toy in an upright position every single time. It wasn't normal. A few days later, she bought a baby monitor. One of the older kinds, just an audio monitor, a little speaker she could carry around while she was in another room. She wanted to see if she could hear anything when she wasn't in there. For a while, nothing unusual happened. She went about her day, listening to the usual sounds of a baby, small movements, the occasional noise. Then, one afternoon, while she was in the kitchen fixing my bottle, she heard something strange. Not my usual babbling, not the sound of me fussing. It was something else. A weird, high-pitched noise, almost like a whistle, followed by a lower, humming sound. Like two tones clashing together, rising and falling, irregular, unnatural. She froze. The sound didn't last long, maybe a few seconds, before it faded into silence. She hurried back to the bedroom. I was sitting up in my crib, on all fours, staring at something in the corner of the room. My eyes were wide, unblinking. My little hands were gripping the bars of the crib tightly. I wasn't making any noise. I wasn't moving, just staring. She followed my gaze. The nightstand. She moved closer. Nothing seemed unusual at first. The lamp was there. The clock. A book. And then she saw it. Scratched into the wood, just beneath the lamp, were the words, "I hate messy cribs." She stared at it for a long time. The scratches were deep, deliberate. The wood was old, so the lighter color beneath the surface stood out sharply against the darker finish. Her hands were shaking when she reached out to touch it. The carving wasn't new. The edges weren't rough, like it had been done recently. The scratches had darkened slightly, like they had been there for a while. But she knew they hadn't been there before. She had dusted that nightstand just a few days ago. She would have noticed. She picked me up, held me against her chest, and walked out of the room. That night, she showed my dad. He frowned, ran his fingers over the scratches, but still wasn't convinced. He said maybe the nightstand had come like that. Maybe she just hadn't noticed it before. She told him she wanted to leave. He didn't agree right away, but she insisted. She didn't feel safe in the apartment anymore. She didn't want to sleep in a room with something like that right next to us. A week later, we moved in with my grandparents while they searched for another place. My mom didn't bring much from the apartment. Most of the furniture stayed behind, including the nightstand. She never figured out who or what had carved those words. She never understood how my crib had been tidied when she wasn't in the room. But she never forgot it. Years later, when I was older, she tried looking up information about the apartment. There wasn't much. No deaths, no strange history. Just an old building like any other. But she swears, to this day, that something wasn't right about that place. And that leaving when we did was the best decision she ever made. I don't know how long I had been lying there, staring at the wall, trying to force my mind to shut off. My aunt had just passed away. It still didn't feel real. It felt like she could call me at any second, like I could check my phone and see a text from her, like I would walk into the kitchen tomorrow and hear my mom talking about her as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. She was gone. I wasn't the kind of person who believed in ghosts or anything like that. Even as a kid, I had never been scared of the dark. I didn't get nervous about old houses or creaky floors. I wasn't the type to freak out over shadows or tell ghost stories at sleepovers. When people talked about seeing things, about signs from lost loved ones, I nodded along but never really believed it. I thought grief could make people see what they wanted to see. That night, I just wanted to sleep. My eyes were swollen from crying, and my body felt heavy, like all my muscles had stopped working at once. I had thrown myself onto my bed without even bothering to change, my back to the door, my face pressed into the pillow. My dog, Diesel, was lying near the foot of my bed, curled up like he always was. He was a big dog, bigger than most people expected when they met him, but he was quiet and calm. He never barked unless he had to. He never growled. I don't know how long I lay there before it happened. It started with Diesel shifting on the bed. I heard the rustle of his fur against the blanket, the small creak of the mattress as he moved. At first, I didn't think much of it. He moved around a lot in his sleep. But then I heard the growl. It wasn't loud. It was low and rumbling, coming from deep in his throat. I had never heard him sound like that before. For a second, I stayed still, waiting for him to stop. But he didn't. The growl got deeper. I turned my head slightly, just enough to glance at him. He was standing now, his whole body tense, his ears pulled back. He was staring straight at the door. My stomach clenched. I pushed myself up on my elbows and turned to look at what he was seeing. The door was closed, just like I had left it. But for a second, just a second, I thought I saw something. A dark shape, standing in front of the door. I blinked. My eyes were blurry from the tears, still burning from exhaustion. I wiped them and looked again. Nothing. Just my mind playing tricks on me. That had to be it. I let out a slow breath and laid back down, rolling onto my side again. I reached out and gave Diesel a small pat on his back, trying to calm him down. After a moment, he let out a low huff and laid down again, but I could still feel the tension in his body. I closed my eyes and tried to relax. I wasn't sure how much time had passed before it happened again. Diesel's growl started up, low and warning, and this time, before I even turned around, I felt something shift in the room. Then, clear as day, I heard it. A voice. "Goodbye, JR." It wasn't loud. It wasn't a whisper either. It was just there, in the air, like someone had spoken from across the room. My whole body went cold. I shot up, heart hammering so hard I could barely breathe. Diesel was still staring at the door, his lips slightly curled, his body stiff as a board. I looked around the room, my brain scrambling to find an explanation, something logical. The TV was off. My phone was across the room, screen dark. I was alone in the house. And then, as I was looking around, something else happened. The balloons. I had a bunch of balloons in my room from something else. I don't even remember why they were there, but they had been tied together in the corner near my desk. I hadn't thought much about them. They had just been floating there for days. But as I stood there, frozen, I watched as one of the balloons slowly drifted away from the rest. It didn't make sense. They had all been tied together. There was no way one could just separate on its own. But it did. It broke away from the rest and started moving. Not floating randomly, not just drifting in one direction like a normal balloon would. It circled the room. I stood there, unable to move, watching as it made a slow, looping path. The air felt wrong. I tried to tell myself it was the air conditioning, but the AC wasn't even on. The windows were closed. There was no draft, no breeze, nothing that could have pushed it like that. It circled once, twice. Then, just as slowly as it had moved away, it drifted back toward the others, coming to a stop against them like nothing had happened. Diesel finally stopped growling, but his eyes were still locked on the door. His tail was low, his body stiff. I stood there for a long time, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. After what felt like forever, I sat back down on my bed, still staring at the balloons, waiting for them to move again. They didn't. I didn't sleep that night. Even though I told myself there had to be a logical explanation, that my brain was messing with me, that I was just exhausted and grieving and seeing things that weren't there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in that room. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just my imagination. But Diesel had seen something, heard something, and Diesel didn't imagine things. I don't remember exactly how old I was when it happened, but I know I was a teenager, maybe 15 or 16, old enough to be outside on my own at night without it being a big deal, but still young enough that something about the dark made me uneasy. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but a constant awareness, a feeling in my stomach like I was being watched even when I knew I wasn't. The kind of thing you learn to ignore over time because nothing ever actually happens. Until one night, something did. I grew up in a small town. The kind of place where everybody knows each other, or at least knows someone who does. It was quiet, slow-moving, nothing like a city. The roads were mostly empty after dark, and there weren't many places for people to go at night anyway. A gas station, a diner, a handful of bars. Nothing that explained why a man I had never seen before in my life was standing in my front yard less than 2 feet behind me. It started with my cat. She wasn't really an indoor cat, but she wasn't fully outdoor either. She was independent, went where she wanted, and usually came home on her own. She had a habit of scratching at my bedroom window when she wanted to come in, and she almost always showed up at the perfect time, right when I started to feel that familiar unease settling in. I don't know why I felt so impatient that night. It wasn't even that late, maybe 10 or 11, but for some reason, I wanted her inside. Maybe because my room always felt a little off at night, especially when I was alone. Maybe because I'd had too many nights where I woke up drenched in sweat, heart pounding from nightmares I couldn't fully remember. I don't know. All I know is I got up, went outside, and started calling for her. The night was quiet. It always was in that town, but there was something about it that felt heavier than usual. The streetlights weren't bright, just dim patches of yellow scattered along the road, leaving a lot of darkness between them. The air was still, cool against my skin, and the houses around me were mostly dark, everyone already inside for the night. I stood on the porch for a moment, then stepped off into the yard. I walked a few steps, not far, just enough to see if she was hiding under one of the cars or near the bushes by the porch. "Here, kitty kitty," I called softly. Nothing. I tried again, a little louder. Still nothing. I sighed and gave up pretty quickly. She'd come back when she was ready. She always did. I turned to go back inside. And there he was. A man, standing directly behind me. I didn't hear him. I didn't see him approach. 1 second I was alone, and the next he was there. Less than 2 feet away. Close enough that if I had reached my hand out, I would have touched him. I froze. He just stood there, staring at me. He was old, or at least older. His hair was gray, his face lined with deep wrinkles. His clothes were plain, dark, unremarkable. I had never seen him before in my life. For a second, neither of us moved. I don't even think I breathed. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. How long had he been standing there? Had he been watching me the whole time? Why was he so close? Why wasn't he saying anything? I don't know how I managed to stay calm, but I did. I turned around and walked back to the house. Not too fast, not running, just walking. My heart was slamming against my ribs, but I forced myself to move normally. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if he was following me. I didn't want to see him move. The second I stepped inside, I locked the door. My hands were shaking. My whole body was shaking. I stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself that it wasn't as bad as it seemed. Maybe he was just a confused old man. Maybe he was lost, or drunk, or looking for someone else. But none of it made sense. There were no cars parked outside that didn't belong to us. No footsteps in the gravel or on the pavement. Nothing to explain how he got there or where he came from. I wanted to tell my parents, but I didn't. Not at first. I don't know why. Maybe because I didn't want to sound paranoid. Maybe because saying it out loud would make it real. I stood there, hands gripping the edge of the counter, my breathing too fast, trying to convince myself it wasn't as bad as I thought. But the longer I stood there, the worse it felt. I told my dad. He didn't hesitate. He went straight outside, stomping through the yard, checking around the house, looking down the street. I stood in the doorway, watching, my stomach twisted in knots. But there was nothing. No one. The man was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about how close he had been, how easily he could have reached out, grabbed me. How if I had waited even 1 second longer to turn around, maybe I wouldn't have made it back inside. I never saw him again. Not once. I told myself it was nothing. Just some old man, maybe passing through. But the more I think about it, the worse it gets. Our town was small. The kind of place where strangers stand out. If he lived there, I would have seen him again. Someone would have known him. My mother and grandmother were practically local celebrities. They knew everyone, but no one knew him. And no one ever saw him again. I don't know who he was. I don't know why he was there. And I don't want to know. I was already half asleep when I felt it, an impact against my back. Not a light tap, not a shove, but something in between, just firm enough to jolt me out of the fog of sleep. My eyes shot open, my heart hammering in confusion. For a few seconds, I just lay there breathing, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. Sleep paralysis, maybe? Or one of those weird hypnic jerks where your brain makes you think you're falling. But this wasn't like that. It wasn't inside my head. It was real. I turned over and sat up, rubbing the spot where I'd been hit. My window was closed. That made me pause. I always kept it open when I slept. It was just a habit. Something about the fresh air helped me relax at night. But now it was shut tight. My first thought was that my friend had come in and closed it while I was sleeping. Maybe he thought I'd get cold or something. It was a possibility, but something about it felt off. I got up, stretching the stiffness out of my shoulders, and went to open the window again. That's when I saw him. Across the yard, in my neighbor's grass, a man stood completely still. He was far enough away that I couldn't make out much detail, but I knew instinctively that he was staring at me. His body faced forward, but his head was turned unnaturally to the side, locked in my direction. A chill ran through me. My eyes adjusted slowly to the dark, and I was sure, he was holding something in his hand. A wooden plank, maybe. I could just barely make out the shape. For a moment, I didn't move. I barely breathed. I wasn't sure what to do. He wasn't on my property, technically, but he was close. Too close. I glanced toward my door, wondering if I should wake my friend, but when I looked back, he was gone. I felt a wave of unease crawl up my spine. I stayed frozen for a long moment, listening, but everything outside was silent. The whole neighborhood seemed still, except for the faint hum of distant traffic. No movement, no footsteps, just the normal nighttime quiet. I swallowed and reached for the window, hesitating before pushing it all the way open. I leaned out slightly, scanning the street, my neighbor's yard, the sidewalk beyond. Nothing. I told myself it was fine. Probably just some guy passing through. Maybe he was just lost. Maybe he hadn't been looking at me at all. But then there was the window. I knew I hadn't closed it. And I sure as hell knew my friend wouldn't have just walked into my room while I was sleeping. He wasn't that type of person. The thought unsettled me in a way I couldn't shake. I stepped back, closed the window again, and locked it. I stood there for a long time, watching the darkness outside, waiting to see if he'd come back. I wasn't sure how long I stood there, but eventually, the exhaustion from before crept back in, weighing down my limbs. I sat down on the bed, still facing the window, still watching. At some point, my body won the fight against my nerves, and I drifted off. The next morning, I woke up groggy and uneasy. The memory of the night before clung to me like a bad dream, but I knew it had been real. I glanced at the window again, making sure it was still locked. It was. I got up and went about my morning routine, trying to shake the weird feeling in my gut. But when I stepped outside, my stomach dropped. In the dirt just below my window, I saw them, footprints. Deep impressions in the earth, right up against the wall. Whoever had been there had been standing directly beneath my window, and my window was 10 feet off the ground. We had been camping by the lake for 2 days, and it was one of the more remote spots we had ever chosen. My family had always loved the outdoors, hiking, fishing, and just being out in the wild. I grew up in Idaho, and spending weekends deep in the forests or next to lakes was just part of life. But this trip was different from our usual spots. This lake was farther out than we usually went, and it was well known for the large wolf population in the area. That fact alone made me a little uneasy, but my dad assured me that as long as we stored our food properly and didn't wander off alone, we'd be fine. The first couple of days were uneventful. The lake was beautiful, the air was crisp, and the forest was dense and untouched. We had a few distant encounters with wildlife. A herd of elk moving through the trees in the morning mist, the occasional rustling in the brush at night, probably raccoons or some other small animal looking for food, but nothing that really made me feel unsafe. It was our second night at camp when it happened. I woke up in the middle of the night with the unmistakable, urgent need to relieve myself. It was cold outside, and I really didn't want to leave my sleeping bag, but the pressure in my bladder made the decision for me. I fumbled for my flashlight in the dark, trying not to wake my family as I unzipped the tent as quietly as possible. Stepping outside, the air was colder than I expected, and I could see my breath in the light of the flashlight. The campsite was completely still. The fire had burned down to embers, and the only sounds were the occasional creaks and groans of the forest. The lake was just beyond the tree line, and I could hear the faintest lapping of water against the shore. I walked a short distance from the tent, just far enough to have some privacy, but not so far that I couldn't find my way back in the dark. I aimed the flashlight at the ground in front of me, casting long shadows through the trees. The silence felt heavier out here, away from the tent. I could feel it pressing down on me, wrapping around me like a thick blanket. As I was in the middle of relieving myself, a strange feeling washed over me, an overwhelming sense that I was being watched. It wasn't just paranoia, I could feel it in my gut. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and a cold wave of fear spread through my chest. My breathing hitched, and I gripped the flashlight a little tighter. I hesitated for a second before slowly sweeping the light in front of me. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees and underbrush. And then I saw them. 6 pairs of glowing golden eyes, staring at me from about 15 yards away. My heart slammed against my ribs, and my breath caught in my throat. They were completely still, just watching. My hands trembled slightly as I held the flashlight steady. The eyes reflected the light in a way that made them look like they were glowing from within. I couldn't see the shapes of their bodies, just those eyes, cold, calculating, and locked onto me. For what felt like an eternity, I stood frozen in place, unable to move, unable to breathe. My body was still catching up to what my brain already knew. This was a pack of wolves, and I was standing alone in the dark, vulnerable, separated from my family by only a short distance. I forced myself to breathe as quietly as possible. My mind raced, trying to remember what I had read about wolves. They were usually wary of humans. They rarely attacked people. But these ones weren't running. They weren't backing away. They were just watching. Slowly, I swept the flashlight back across the area, and when I moved it back, the eyes were gone. I blinked, my pulse still hammering in my ears. My body felt locked in place, my legs refusing to move even though every instinct was screaming at me to get back to the tent. The silence around me felt heavier than before. Not even the wind was moving through the trees. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to take a step back. Then another. I turned, keeping the flashlight pointed toward where I had seen the eyes, half expecting them to reappear. My breath came in short, uneven bursts, my whole body tense. The tent felt a mile away, but I kept moving, forcing my legs to work. When I reached the tent, I practically dove inside, zipping it up as quickly and as quietly as I could. I crawled back into my sleeping bag, but there was no way I was going back to sleep. My ears were hyper-aware of every single noise outside. The slightest rustle in the leaves, the occasional creak of a tree shifting in the wind, distant water sloshing against the shore. Every single sound sent a fresh jolt of fear through my body. I lay there, staring at the fabric of the tent, my mind playing through every possible scenario. Were they still out there? Had they followed me back to the tent? Had they been there the entire time, watching us while we slept? I wanted to check, but I couldn't bring myself to unzip the tent again. Time crawled by. My body was exhausted, but my mind wouldn't shut off. Every single noise outside made me flinch. I imagined seeing those eyes just outside the thin fabric of the tent, imagined hearing the sound of paws pressing into the dirt just feet away. I knew it was irrational. If the wolves had wanted to attack me, they would have done it already. But fear doesn't listen to logic. It just tightens its grip and refuses to let go. At some point, I must have drifted into a light, fitful sleep because the next thing I knew, the faint glow of early morning was filtering through the tent. The sounds of birds chirping and the distant rustling of small animals replaced the eerie stillness of the night. I hesitated before unzipping the tent and stepping outside. The morning air was crisp, and everything looked so normal, so peaceful. The embers from the fire were completely cold now, and the lake stretched out in front of me, reflecting the soft light of dawn. I forced myself to walk back to where I had been the night before. My stomach tightened as I approached, but there was nothing there, no tracks, no signs of anything unusual. The ground looked undisturbed. If it weren't for the lingering unease in my chest, I might have thought I had imagined the whole thing. But I knew what I had seen. Those wolves had been watching me, and for whatever reason, they had decided to disappear before I could fully process what was happening. I don't know if it was curiosity, caution, or something else entirely that kept them from coming closer. I never told my family about it. Part of me didn't want to acknowledge it out loud, didn't want to hear someone else brush it off as nothing. But I knew. That night, I had been alone in the dark, face to face with something wild. And they had been watching. When I was little, I was very religious. It kind of stumped my parents, though. We identified as Catholic and attended church most Sundays, but religion was not a major fixture in our home by any means. My dad thought it was kind of weird, but he was definitely somewhat pleased by it. He's Puerto Rican and was raised in a very religious home. If I remember correctly, I think he even considered becoming a priest for a short while when he was a teenager. He was always more religious than my mother or anyone else in the family, but by the time I was 7, he wasn't particularly religious anymore. I remember a certain Sunday at church when the priest started talking about divine visions. We learned about people who had been visited by Mary or had seen Jesus in the flesh, and they received messages from God. I was completely fascinated by the idea. For a week straight, I couldn't stop asking my dad about it. I pictured these visions so clearly in my mind. People standing in fields, looking up with awe and reverence, the divine presence surrounding them. They seemed so serene, so special. They were chosen by God, and I thought it was the greatest gift one could receive. What really struck me during that sermon was the priest's mention of people being vessels for God's message. I didn't fully understand what he meant at the time, but to me, it felt like such an important job. These people were carrying God's word, and it seemed like such an honor. I thought if it could happen to someone, then why not me? After all, I was ready. So one night, I made a decision. I prayed, and I told God that I was ready to be a vessel for his message. I was only 7, but I felt certain. I offered myself to him, saying I was ready to serve, to carry his word to others. I told him I was available whenever he needed me. I didn't know exactly what that meant, but I thought it would be something extraordinary. I thought that by offering myself up, I might be one of the people who could experience these divine visions. Shortly after, strange things started happening. It wasn't immediate, but I began to notice a shift in my dreams. At first, it was subtle, a strange heaviness, a sensation that I couldn't quite explain. I didn't understand what was happening, but every time I closed my eyes, there was something different, something off. I tried to ignore it, but the dreams became more vivid, more real. I still remember the first one that truly stood out. It started with a strange, almost suffocating heaviness as I fell asleep. I felt slow and sluggish, like gravity itself was holding me down. The air felt thick, and there was a sensation that I was being pulled deeper into sleep against my will. The room around me was dark, but the darkness was somehow comforting, like I was sinking into it. Then, everything changed. I found myself in a vast field, but there was something strange about it. The air was thick with fog, and I couldn't see far in front of me. It was an eerie kind of fog, almost like it was alive. It swirled and moved as if it had a mind of its own, gently caressing the ground and rising up to my knees. And then, as the fog began to clear, I saw it. An angel. Or at least, that's what it looked like. But it wasn't a living being. It wasn't a moving figure in the traditional sense. It was more like an engraving. The figure was made of tin, and it had been intricately etched, with the image of the angel standing tall, wings spread wide. It was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about it too. The colors of the engraving seemed to shift in the fog, casting off a faint glow. The angel's eyes were large and haunting, staring directly at me. And then, I heard the voice. It was a woman's voice, soft and peaceful, but there was something strange about it. It sounded distant, almost mechanical, like an automated phone operator, but with a calm tone that made it seem even more unsettling. The voice spoke slowly, deliberately, like each word was meant to be absorbed with the utmost attention. Camo 305, it said, slowly pronouncing my name. It is very important that you listen very carefully to what I am about to tell you. This is a message from God, and he needs you to remember it very carefully. I don't know why, but something about the way she said my name, the way the words echoed in my head, made a wave of fear wash over me. My heart began to race. I couldn't explain why, but I felt like something was very, very wrong. The angel, the voice, the fog, it all felt too real. It was too much. I started crying in my dream. I begged for the voice to stop, for the angel to leave me alone. No, not me, please, not me. I cried over and over, my voice shaking, louder and louder until the words felt like they were tearing me apart. But the voice didn't stop. It continued speaking, its calm tone in sharp contrast to the panic that had overtaken me. You must listen, the voice insisted, its words ringing in my ears. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't understand what was happening, but I knew I didn't want it. I didn't want to hear this message. I didn't want to be the vessel, the one chosen to carry God's message. I was just a little girl, too young to bear such a responsibility. As I pleaded, the vision of the angel began to distort. It became blurry, like I was looking through a fogged-up window. The angel's form started to fade away, its features blurring into nothingness. I woke up, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. I was in my bed, drenched in sweat, the room still dark around me. I looked around frantically, my breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. My mom was standing by my side, her face filled with concern. She had heard me crying in my sleep, heard my distress. She gently shook me awake, her voice soft but worried. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" "It was just a nightmare," she said, her voice soothing, but I could hear the tremor of concern beneath it. "You're safe now." But I wasn't sure if I was safe. I wasn't sure if I would ever be safe again. My mind raced as I tried to comprehend what had just happened. Was it a dream? Was it real? It didn't feel like a normal dream. It felt like something much deeper, something that wasn't meant for me to understand. The nightmares continued for weeks. Every time I closed my eyes, I feared I would be pulled back into that foggy field, the angel, and the voice that wouldn't stop. I started staying awake late into the night, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't control. I would hear the voice in my head, echoing the words from the dream. You must listen carefully. This is a message from God. I tried to tell my mom about it, but she didn't understand. She would tuck me into bed, giving me gentle kisses on the forehead, and tell me it was just a dream. God isn't trying to tell you anything, sweetheart, she would reassure me, though I didn't believe her. I didn't trust my dreams anymore. They were too real, too vivid. The angel, the voice, they haunted me. And then one night, the dream came again. But this time, it wasn't just a dream. I felt that same heaviness as I drifted off to sleep, that same suffocating weight pulling me under. I saw the fog again, but this time, there was no angel. There was only darkness. The voice came, though, the same slow, mechanical voice. But it wasn't speaking to me anymore. It was speaking to someone else. I could hear the words, but they were muffled, distorted, as if they were meant for someone far away. The fear I felt that night was different. It was a sense of isolation, of being completely cut off from the world. I wasn't just scared of the voice. I was scared of being abandoned by everyone I knew, of being left alone in the dark with a message I couldn't understand. The dream stopped after that. Not because I stopped being afraid, but because I think I eventually convinced myself that they were just dreams. It took years for the fear to fade, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in me. Something had been touched, whether by God or something else, I couldn't say. Eventually, my obsession with religion faded. I grew up, and by the time I was a teenager, I no longer attended church with my parents. I never got confirmed, and I started to question everything I once believed in. I became agnostic, unsure of what I had experienced, unsure of what any of it meant. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I remember the fog, the angel, and the voice that tried to tell me something I wasn't ready to hear. And I wonder if, somewhere deep inside me, I'm still waiting for an answer to the message I was supposed to carry. I remember that night like it was yesterday, even though it's been 2 years now. It was one of those decisions I thought would be no big deal, like a harmless adventure. But in the end, it turned out to be one of the scariest, most confusing experiences I've ever had. I had heard about this new thing going around. Some kind of incense that supposedly got you high. Everyone was talking about it. Well, mostly the people I hung out with. The guy who sold it to me said it was strong stuff. But of course, I didn't listen. I thought to myself, it's just incense. How strong could it really be? So, I went over to my friend's house that evening, thinking I'd just try it out and see what the hype was all about. I remember feeling kind of excited, like it was some sort of secret club that I was finally being let into. I grabbed my lighter, rolled up a spliff, and thought to myself that this was going to be a good time. I didn't think twice about it. I wasn't even concerned about what could go wrong because, well, I figured it was just incense. I lit the spliff, took my first hit, and then a second. I felt like I was being cautious. I didn't want to jump in too deep. I sat back, waiting, but nothing happened. No buzzing, no high. It felt like I had just smoked regular tobacco or something. I waited a few minutes, but still nothing. It started to bug me, honestly. I felt like I'd been gypped, like the guy who sold me the stuff had tricked me into wasting my money. So, without really thinking, I smoked the rest of the spliff. I thought maybe I just needed to take more, that it would eventually kick in. I felt pretty chill, like I was playing it safe. At that point, I didn't feel any different at all. My friend was sitting across from me, doing some dishes in the kitchen, and we were chatting about random stuff, laughing here and there. Everything seemed normal. It was just another night with a friend. But then, out of nowhere, her dad walked in. He was a big guy, usually pretty chill, but that night, he looked different. His eyes were locked on me. There was something in his gaze that made me feel instantly uncomfortable. He stood there for a second, just staring. I remember thinking, what the hell is going on? Then he spoke, his voice low, but sharp. Did you get my daughter high? I froze. I couldn't even answer him at first. I didn't know how to respond. I didn't even know how I got into this situation. But I managed to choke out a response. No, I said. I didn't. I don't know if he heard me, or if he didn't believe me. But whatever happened next was a blur. In one split second, he sprinted towards me. My heart jumped into my throat. I didn't have time to think. I was sitting in a chair, and in one move, I fell backward, narrowly missing a punch that could have knocked me out. My hands shot out to catch myself, and I hit the back of the chair with a thud. The chair was too flimsy, and I felt it tip backward. Before I could fully get up, I saw the sliding glass door next to me. I knew I had to make a run for it. It was the only way out. My brain screamed at me to escape. I shoved the door open with my hand, but before I could fully get through, I felt something slam down on my foot. It was his foot. I had no idea how the hell he got to it so quickly, but I felt a sharp pain shoot up my leg. I ignored it though, my body acting on instinct. I pulled my foot free and bolted. The pain was nothing compared to the terror coursing through my veins. I sprinted, almost blindly, but I could hear him behind me. His heavy footsteps were close, like he was right on my tail. The fence was coming up fast, and I pushed myself harder, leaping over it with a grunt. My legs were burning, but I didn't stop. I just ran. The night air felt cold against my skin as I tore through the yard. My heart was thumping in my chest, my breath ragged. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear the sound of footsteps getting quieter, fading behind me. I didn't stop running until I was clear of the house, out into the open road, away from everything. But then, just as suddenly as it started, it all stopped. My breath came in sharp bursts, my chest heaving. I found myself sitting back down, back at the kitchen table in my friend's house, watching her do dishes like nothing had happened. My mind was racing, trying to process it all. How was this possible? How did I end up back here? I blinked, confused, my heart still pounding in my ears. I glanced around, trying to piece it together, but nothing made sense. I had been running for my life only seconds ago. Now it felt like I had just come back. The sense of panic, the adrenaline, the fear, it was like it had never happened. I shook my head, unsure if I was hallucinating or if my mind was just playing tricks on me. I needed to get out of there. Something was wrong. I told my friend I was going to lie down. She didn't seem to think anything was off, but I didn't care. I just needed to be alone for a while. I stumbled to the couch and lay down, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. I grabbed a pillow and hugged it against my chest, the soft cotton fabric offering me some comfort, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I closed my eyes, trying to calm myself down, but the room kept spinning. I couldn't tell if it was the incense or something else. My body felt heavy, and my mind was foggy. As I drifted off, I felt the pillow almost mold itself around me, as if it were becoming a part of me. The weight of it, the softness, it felt wrong. But I didn't care anymore. I welcomed it. There was no fear anymore, just this overwhelming sensation of everything folding in on me. It felt like I was sinking, like I was becoming one with the pillow, one with the bed, one with everything. My thoughts started to blur, and a strange, peaceful calm washed over me. The chaos of the night seemed distant, like it had happened in another life. Then something shifted. It was like I was floating, but I couldn't move. It was as though the world had stopped turning, but I was still stuck in the middle of it, drifting. I don't know how long I stayed there, trapped between sleep and wakefulness. It felt like time had no meaning, like everything was just suspended. Eventually, I woke up. The room was still dim, the air thick with silence. I was back in my body, but it felt strange, like I had just returned from somewhere far away. My head was pounding, my thoughts disjointed. The weight of what had happened began to sink in, and I felt a wave of shock wash over me. What had I just experienced? Was it the incense? Had I been hallucinating? I felt a pit in my stomach. I couldn't believe it. It felt like I had slipped into another reality for a brief moment, like I had almost lost myself. I couldn't even put the experience into words. It was like a nightmare I couldn't explain. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't want to sound crazy. I threw the rest of the incense away and vowed never to touch it again. I didn't care about the high or whatever it was supposed to do for me. The fear I had felt, the confusion, it was enough. I knew I couldn't go back to that. To this day, I still don't know if it was the incense that messed with my head, or if I was just exhausted, or if I'd gotten too carried away. All I know is that whatever it was, I wasn't willing to try it again. I wasn't willing to risk losing control of myself again. It wasn't worth it. I had no idea how deep we were when I first heard the sound. It started as a faint hum, something I barely even noticed over the shuffle of feet and the steady drip of water from the ceiling. The air was cold, thick with moisture, and my breath came out in short, damp puffs. I kept my headlamp fixed on the rough stone walls, following the glow of the lights ahead of me, taking careful steps so I didn't trip on the uneven ground. The cave was narrow here, barely wide enough to stand upright without scraping my helmet against the ceiling. Then the sound deepened. A vibration, low and heavy, like something massive shifting far beneath us. I thought for a second that I was imagining it. The noise felt distant, buried somewhere inside the rock itself. But it kept growing, becoming more than a sound, something I could feel. My stomach clenched, and I turned to look back at the others behind me. The light from my headlamp cut through the darkness, illuminating the figures of my group. There were 8 of us in total. 5 guys, 3 girls. We were in a single file line, moving cautiously down the narrow passage. The person closest to me was Tracy, struggling to keep up. She had been a problem since the beginning, slowing us down, complaining, refusing to listen to instructions. She wasn't even wearing her wet suit yet, despite us telling her over and over to put it on before we entered the cave. I looked past her at the others. Behind her was Dave, her boyfriend, whose patience with her was wearing thin. He had already pulled her out of trouble twice during the descent. Further back were 2 more guys whose names I barely remembered, and finally, at the very end, Joe. Joe. I had only known him for a couple of days, but I would remember him for the rest of my life. He was the oldest in the group, probably in his late 40s, maybe early 50s. We had met him at a climber's cafe on the way to the cave. He had been sitting alone at a corner table, sipping coffee and studying a map, when Rick, our supposed leader, struck up a conversation. Turned out he was headed to the same cave we were, alone. That should have been a red flag, but at the time, we saw it as an opportunity. More gear, more experience, less risk. Joe had been quiet during the hike, but the morning of the descent, he hesitated. He told us he had a bad feeling about the climb. We laughed him off, told him not to jinx it. I remember him shrugging and suiting up without another word. Now, deep inside the cave, I saw his headlamp flicker violently. Then I heard him scream, "Run!" His voice was raw, desperate. I had never heard a grown man scream like that before. I had never heard pure terror, not until that moment. Then I saw him move. Joe was at the very back of the group, but he shot forward like his life depended on it. He sprinted through the passage, his headlamp bouncing wildly as he shoved past the others, barely slowing down. My brain was still catching up when I felt it, the sudden rush of air, the way the temperature dropped in an instant. Then I heard the water, a deep, deafening roar, growing louder by the second. The walls around us trembled, and suddenly I understood. Flash flood. It didn't matter that the sky had been clear when we started. Somewhere above us, miles away, rain had fallen. The water had found its way into the cave system, and now it was coming for us. I ran. My wetsuit clung to my skin, making it harder to move, but I forced my legs to push forward. The ground was slick, uneven. I stumbled, caught myself, ran harder. The sound behind me was growing, thunderous, relentless. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw it. Water. A wall of it, rushing through the tunnel, swallowing everything in its path. Tracy froze. She stopped moving completely, standing there in the middle of the passage as the flood came closer. She wasn't even wearing her wetsuit. She wasn't ready for the cold. Move. Dave grabbed her and pulled with everything he had. She fought him, but he dragged her forward. By then, the water had reached my ankles. 30 seconds later, it was at my knees. Another 30, and it was at my waist. The cold was unlike anything I had ever felt. It sucked the air from my lungs, sent a shock through my body. The current was strong, pulling at me, threatening to drag me under. I fought to keep moving, pushing through the rising flood, trying not to think about what would happen if I slipped. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber. The moment I entered, my legs went numb. The water here was still deep, and so cold it burned. It was darker than the passage before, the ceiling higher, the walls smooth and wet. I barely managed to keep my head above the surface as I kicked forward. Somewhere behind me, the others followed. We had reached the lowest point of the cave. That realization hit like a punch to the gut. Water always finds the lowest point. We had run straight into a dead end. The flood kept coming, filling the chamber, swallowing everything. Joe's voice cut through the chaos. "Get inside the crevice." I didn't hesitate. I clawed my way toward a narrow opening in the rock and shoved myself inside. The others did the same, scrambling into whatever gaps they could find. Then we watched. The water kept rising. It climbed higher and higher, filling the chamber, creeping toward us. The The sobs of the girls echoed through the cave. No one else spoke. No one moved. We were trapped. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The water was still. The cave was silent. I kept waiting for it to rise again, to take us. But it didn't. Then slowly, it began to recede. First, just a few inches. Then more. We waited. When it was low enough, we clambered down. My limbs were weak, shaking. The cold had settled into my bones. My head throbbed. But we were alive. We weren't out yet. We still had to get back to the surface, and without the right gear, we would have been stuck for days. But Joe had the gear. The old man we had picked up by chance, the one we had almost ignored, had everything we needed to get out. Rick, our so-called leader, had brought the wrong equipment. If Joe hadn't been there, we wouldn't have made it. It took hours to climb back out. 2 more days to hike back to our cars. Tracy nearly collapsed from hypothermia. Her wetsuit was too thin, too loose. She had ignored every warning. If we had been stuck any longer, she wouldn't have made it. When I finally reached my car, I sat inside for a long time. My hands were still shaking. My body still ached. I thought about the water, the sound of it, the way it had rushed toward us, unstoppable, uncaring. I thought about the questions that had filled my mind when I thought I was going to die. But mostly I thought about Joe, and how close we had come to never making it out at all. College dorms had their fair share of weird people. That was something I knew going in. You'd hear stories about oddball roommates, or the kid who never left his room, the guy who hoarded garbage, or the girl who talked to herself. But you never think any of it is going to be your problem. It's just background noise, funny stories to tell later. I lived on the 2nd floor of one of the older dorm buildings, a place that had seen decades of students come and go. The walls were thin, the communal bathrooms were grimy no matter how much they got cleaned, and the whole place had this musty, lived-in smell that never really went away. My roommates and I were the loud ones, laughing, playing music, bullshitting until way too late at night. We didn't try to be obnoxious, but we weren't exactly quiet either. That's how we ended up meeting him. One night, we were being extra loud, music up, talking over each other, probably being annoying as hell to everyone else. The door was open like usual. At some point, someone walked in, just wandered straight into our room like he belonged there. He was a little off from the start. Not in an obviously dangerous way, just strange. His expression never quite fit the moment, like he was reacting to a different conversation than the one actually happening. He was lanky, with bad posture, and had this way of standing too close without realizing it. He introduced himself, said he lived upstairs, and that was that. He started hanging around after that night, showing up when we were smoking or drinking, never really invited but always there. At first, we let it slide. He was weird, sure, but harmless. He talked a lot about how people never understood him, how he had been through a lot in his life. The way he said it, you could almost feel bad for him. Almost. But the more time we spent around him, the harder it got to ignore how uncomfortable he made us. He didn't just talk about feeling left out or misunderstood. He talked about it with this kind of bitterness, like he was holding a grudge against the entire world. He had this habit of staring too long at people when they spoke, like he was studying them instead of just listening. And then there were the things he said when he got too comfortable, offhand comments about violence or death, always with this little smirk, like he was testing how far he could push before people told him to shut up. I had a bad feeling about him early on, but I wasn't the kind of person to start shit for no reason. Instead, I just stopped making an effort. I avoided eye contact when he was around, kept my answers short when he spoke to me. It should have been simple, just letting things fizzle out. But he didn't take the hint. He started showing up more. If we were hanging out in someone else's room, he'd find us. If I walked back from class, he always seemed to be coming from the same direction. It got harder to pretend it was just a coincidence, so I made it obvious. When he joined a smoke session, I'd leave early. When he knocked on our door, I wouldn't answer. He wasn't great at picking up on social cues, but eventually, he got the message. That's when things changed. At first, he just got quieter. Instead of trying to start conversations, he would just sit there, watching. The smirk disappeared. The bitterness got heavier in the air. And then, almost overnight, it turned into full-blown hostility. He still hung around the others, but I could feel him looking at me differently. I wasn't just another person ignoring him. I was the one who had rejected him outright. He hated me for it. I wasn't paranoid. The tension was real. I'd catch him staring when he thought I wasn't paying attention, not just looking but glaring. If I walked past him in the hallway, he wouldn't move an inch, forcing me to go around him. He never said anything outright, never called me out or threatened me. But I knew. And then one night, I walked into my room and saw him sitting there, talking to my roommate. There were a couple of other people in the room, friends of ours, but no one looked comfortable. My roommate was nodding along to whatever he was saying, but his face was tight, like he was just waiting for it to be over. I set my bag down, trying to act normal, but the moment I actually processed what he was saying, my stomach twisted. He was talking about his past again, how people had always treated him like he didn't belong. But this time, he wasn't just venting. He was smiling. It was a thin, tight-lipped grin, and his eyes looked darker than usual. He said, like it was just another part of the conversation, "Yeah, I'm a sadist. So if I ever killed anyone, I would torture them first." The room went silent. Everyone looked at each other. No one laughed. No one brushed it off. Because this wasn't some drunk idiot saying edgy shit for attention. He was serious, and he was looking right at me. I don't know how long the silence lasted. It felt stretched out, heavy and unbearable, but in reality, it was probably just a couple of seconds. Someone mumbled something about needing to go, and then, one by one, we all found excuses to leave. I went straight to the RA. I laid it all out. The weird behavior, the staring, the hostility, the fact that he had just admitted, casually, that he was capable of doing something terrible. The RA nodded, listened, and then shrugged. "He hasn't done anything," they said. "We can't kick him out for being weird." That was it. That was all they had to say about it. So now I had to live with it, knowing that he hated me, knowing that he had thought about hurting people, and knowing that my roommates refused to close our door at night because the heat was unbearable otherwise. I barely slept after that. Every sound in the hallway made me tense up. Every time I heard footsteps on the stairs, I wondered if they were his. But then, just when I was getting used to the constant anxiety, he disappeared. One day he was around, the next he wasn't. No one knew where he went. No transfer, no expulsion. Just gone. At first, I was relieved. I figured maybe someone else had finally reported him, or maybe he'd just decided to leave on his own. But the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I felt. People like him don't just disappear. They don't let things go. I started locking my door at night, even when my roommates left it open. I stopped walking alone. The fear didn't go away just because he wasn't there anymore. Because somewhere out there, he still existed. And he still hated me. I don't know when it all started, or when it became something I noticed every time we sat down for dinner, but I remember it so clearly. We'd gather around the dinner table, the warm smell of my mom's cooking filling the air, and I would sit there, my hands pressed into the edge of the table, my eyes darting between each of my family members. There we were, my mom, dad, older sister, and younger brother, but for some reason, I could never shake the feeling that something was off. Something was missing. It was like a gap in the space around us that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Every time, without fail, I'd glance around the table, trying to make sense of the strange sensation that tugged at the back of my mind. Surely, this couldn't be all of us, right? It felt wrong somehow, like the table was supposed to be fuller, like we were missing a person. I'd shake it off, brushing it aside and trying to focus on my food, but the feeling never truly disappeared. As I got older, the feeling didn't go away. It only seemed to intensify. It was always there, sitting at the back of my mind, just beneath the surface, like something trying to reach out, but never fully revealing itself. At night, as I lay in bed, I would stare up at the ceiling and let my thoughts wander. There were times when I'd find myself drifting off to sleep, almost feeling as if someone were there, beside me, watching over me. It wasn't anything scary, though, nothing ominous. It felt more like a presence that was nurturing, almost protective. I never really thought much of it. I'd just pass it off as being a comforting feeling, something that made the darkness of my room feel a little less daunting. But every now and then, when the feeling would grow stronger, I'd find myself asking, "Who is that?" I never told anyone about it, not for a long time. It just felt wrong, somehow, like I shouldn't be sharing it. I guess I was always a bit of an odd child, quiet, introspective, not really fitting into the mold that others seemed to find so natural. I spent a lot of my time in my own head, thinking about things most kids didn't. My friends didn't seem to understand. They talked about school, about their favorite shows, about their plans for the weekend, and I just sat there, always a bit apart from them. It wasn't that I didn't enjoy their company. I did. But there was this constant feeling that something was just a little off in the world around me. Years passed. I grew older, and the strange feeling, the one that had always been there in the back of my mind, never left. By the time I was in the final years of middle school, I had learned to ignore it for the most part. But then, one evening, while my older sister and I were talking, something changed. It wasn't anything big, just a casual conversation about family, about how things had been when we were younger. But as we talked, I found myself speaking up, confiding in her. I told her that I had always felt like someone was missing, like we were supposed to be more than just the four of us. And then, I told her something else, something that had been on my mind for weeks. I mentioned the presence in my room, the comforting one that seemed to come around when I was feeling down, like it was trying to comfort me. When I finished, there was silence between us. My sister, who had been listening intently, was quiet for a long moment. Then, she exhaled slowly and said, "Whoa." It wasn't much, but it felt like something had shifted in the air. I prodded her, asked her what was going on, what she thought. And that's when she finally spoke. She said something that I'll never forget, something that still echoes in my mind whenever I think about it. "When you were little," she said, "like kindergarten age, you used to cry for a brother we never had." She paused, and I could tell from the tone in her voice that she wasn't joking. "You would talk about him all the time, saying you missed him." My heart skipped a beat. I stared at her, not sure what to make of it. I knew she wasn't lying, she never would. But the words didn't make sense. How could I have had a brother I didn't remember? My mom never talked about it, never mentioned any other pregnancies. We'd never had another brother. So what was she talking about? She went on, explaining that Mom had never been pregnant with another child, that there had never been any talk of another sibling, but I had always insisted on crying for him. I had always said that I missed him, that I wished he were there. It didn't make sense to me. It still doesn't. My mind was reeling. The pieces started to fall into place, but the puzzle didn't quite form a picture I could understand. For all these years, I had felt like something was missing, like there was a hole in the space around me. And now it all seemed to make sense, but it was so unsettling. How could I have known about a brother who never existed? My sister continued, saying that there was one other thing that had always stood out to her. "You used to talk about him like he was real," she said. "And when you cried, it was like you were crying for someone you knew, someone who was part of you." I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to think. How could I have felt something so strongly, something that no one else had ever noticed? Was it just a figment of my imagination, a child's desire for something more than what we had? Or was it something deeper, something I couldn't explain? I spent the next few days thinking about everything. I wondered about the presence that had been with me, the one that seemed to comfort me when I was sad. It wasn't anything I could describe clearly, but it was always there when I needed it, like a warm, invisible hand on my shoulder. Could it have been him? Could it have been my brother? It didn't make sense, but it didn't feel wrong either. The feeling was comforting, soothing even, like I was being taken care of in a way that words couldn't express. But the more I thought about it, the more questions piled up. If I had a brother that never existed, why couldn't anyone else remember him? Why had I been the only one to feel this way? It didn't add up. I tried to convince myself that it was all just a strange coincidence, that maybe I had just had an overactive imagination when I was younger. But deep down, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it, something I would never fully understand. As the years went by, I still think about it. I think about the strange, comforting presence that seemed to be there when I needed it most. I think about the feeling that someone was always missing, like there should have been one more person at our table, one more person in our family. And I still wonder who or what that presence was. Was it my brother? Was it something else entirely? In the end, I guess I'll never truly know. The feeling never left me, but I learned to live with it. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe it was something deeper, something that I'll never fully understand. But whatever it was there for me when I needed it. And in a way, I'll always be grateful for that. But as for the missing piece of the puzzle, the brother who never existed, I guess that's a mystery I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. And maybe that's okay. Some things aren't meant to be understood, and maybe the feeling of being watched over, of being cared for in a way I couldn't explain, was enough. Maybe that was the point all along. I don't know why I disobeyed my dad that day. Maybe it was because I had done it so many times before and nothing bad had ever happened. Maybe it was because I was still just a kid, too young to understand that bad things don't always wait for you to be ready. I don't remember thinking about it much. I just knew my brother's bus was coming, and I loved riding home with him. It was my favorite part of the day. The moment I saw him step off the bus, I knew I was about to fly. I loved how the wind rushed past my face when he pedaled fast, how my legs dangled over the handlebars, how my hands gripped the metal so tight I could feel every little bump in the road. It made me feel weightless, like I was floating through the world, untouchable. That day, my dad told me not to go. I remember standing by the door, one hand gripping my bike's handle, the other hesitating on the doorknob. I don't remember if he gave me a reason, but even if he had, I don't think I would have listened. I was stubborn like that. Nothing bad had ever happened before, so why would it now? I opened the door and went anyway. It wasn't a long ride, just one street over, but I still pedaled hard, my feet pushing against the pedals so fast I could feel the chain grinding. I remember how the air smelled, hot pavement and gasoline from the busy road, the faint hint of something sweet from a tree nearby. The corner where I waited was right next to a gas station, the kind with a little shop attached where people bought snacks and cigarettes and lottery tickets. It was a familiar place, one I had stood at many times before, watching cars rush past, waiting for my brother's bus to pull up. I remember how loud it was that day. The traffic was heavy, car engines roaring past in waves. The light at the intersection changed, and a group of bikers came through. Not just 2 or 3, but a whole pack of them, riding side by side. I had seen bikers before, but never this many all at once. The sound of their engines was so deep it felt like it rumbled inside my chest. I didn't think much of it. They passed by, a blur of leather jackets and chrome, and then they were gone. The traffic kept moving. I kept waiting. Then, a few cars later, I saw them. 2 bikers, riding together, side by side. Something about them felt different from the first group. I don't know what it was, maybe the way they sat on their bikes, maybe the way they moved, slower than the others. But I remember my stomach tightening the moment I saw them. And then it happened. The one on the left turned his head and looked right at me. I don't mean a passing glance. I mean he really looked. And then he said something to the guy next to him, and I saw him lift his arm and point. Pointing at me. I don't know how I knew, but I just did. They were going to come after me. The moment stretched out too long. I saw them slowing down. I saw them looking for a way to turn. I should have run into the gas station. I should have sprinted straight inside where there were people, where I'd be safe. But I didn't. Instead, I did the dumbest thing I could have done. I jumped on my bike and started riding straight down the middle of the street. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I could make it home before they reached me. Maybe I panicked and my body just moved on its own. All I know is that I pedaled harder than I ever had in my life. Everything blurred. The cars, the houses, the trees. I couldn't even see straight anymore. The only thing I could hear was my own breath, coming too fast, and my heart hammering so hard I thought it might explode. I felt dizzy, but I kept going. And then, everything went black. I don't remember falling. I don't remember hitting the ground. The first thing I remember is the smell. Fish. It was strong and sharp, filling my nose, making my stomach turn. My head felt light, my arms and legs heavy. I was on the ground, staring up at the sky, and then I saw her, a woman standing over me. She was tall, or at least she seemed tall from where I lay. Her hands were covered in something wet. I realized later it was fish guts. She must have been cleaning them when she saw me collapse. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't listen. My arms felt like they were filled with sand. Then I heard it. Engines. I turned my head, and there they were. The 2 bikers, turning into the street, coming straight for us. I was frozen. I don't know if it was fear or exhaustion or both, but I couldn't even lift my arms. I just lay there, staring, my whole body locked in place. The woman didn't move either. She just stood there, standing over me, watching them. They got halfway to us and stopped. They didn't say anything, didn't do anything, just sat there on their bikes, staring at her. Then slowly they turned and rode away. I don't know why. Maybe they thought she was my mother. Maybe they didn't want to cause trouble in front of a witness. Maybe they realized how obvious it would be to do something in broad daylight. Or maybe they just changed their minds. The woman didn't say anything. She just helped me up and led me inside her house. It smelled like fish and soap. My legs felt weak, and my hands were shaking so bad I couldn't even hold onto a cup of water she gave me. I sat there for a long time, just staring at the floor. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The way they had looked at me, the way they had turned back. She kept me there for a while. I don't know how long. Maybe half an hour. Maybe more. Then, when she thought it was safe, she took me home through the back lane. I don't remember what I told my dad. I don't remember what he said. But I do remember one thing. The feeling never went away. Even now, after all these years, I still feel it when I see a group of bikers together. That same tightness in my stomach. That same rush of cold fear up my spine. Because that day I was lucky. But I know deep down that luck doesn't last forever. It was Christmas Eve, and I was home alone. I was around 12 or 13, not exactly a little kid, but still young enough that being home by myself at night made me uneasy sometimes. My parents had gone out to a Christmas party, and they wouldn't be back until late. They trusted me to stay alone, and normally, I didn't mind. I had the whole house to myself, which meant I could do whatever I wanted, watch TV, play Xbox, eat snacks on the couch without anyone telling me not to. It was supposed to be a chill night, nothing special, just waiting for them to get back, so we could open a few gifts before bed, the way we usually did on Christmas Eve. The house was warm. The smell of the Christmas tree filled the living room, mixing with the faint scent of sugar cookies my mom had baked earlier. The only lights were the ones on the tree, casting a soft glow over everything. Outside, the night was cold and silent. Snow had fallen earlier in the day, covering everything in a smooth white layer. The roads were empty. It was that time of night when most people were either asleep or gathered in their homes with family, celebrating. I spent a while playing Xbox, getting lost in the game, the sound of gunfire and explosions filling the room. Every once in a while, I'd pause and listen to the house, making sure everything still felt normal. It did. The heat kicked on occasionally, making the vents hum softly. The fridge made its usual low buzzing noise. Nothing strange. Eventually, I turned off the Xbox and flipped through the TV channels for a while, but nothing really interested me. It was getting late, and I was starting to feel tired, so I decided to call it a night. I turned off the TV, made sure the doors were locked, then headed upstairs to my bedroom. I didn't rush, but I felt that slight unease that always came when I turned off all the lights downstairs, leaving the lower part of the house in darkness. My room was cold when I got in, so I climbed under the covers quickly, curling up to get warm. I lay there for a while, waiting for sleep to come, staring at the ceiling in the dim light from the street lamp outside. Everything was quiet, peaceful. But then, out of nowhere, my heart started beating fast. It didn't make any sense. I wasn't scared, nothing had happened, but my chest felt tight, and I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was nothing, maybe just from playing video games for too long. But it wouldn't stop. It was like my body was reacting to something before my brain even knew what it was. I turned onto my side, pulling the blankets tighter around me, trying to focus on my breathing, trying to slow my heart down. I don't know how long I lay there like that, staring at the wall, but then I heard something, a banging at the front door. It wasn't a knock. It was too hard for that. It sounded like someone hitting the door with their fist, firm, deliberate. I froze, my body tensing under the blankets. My first thought was my parents. Maybe they forgot something, but they had a key. Why would they knock? And why so hard? I stayed in bed for a few seconds listening, hoping I'd imagined it. But then it happened again. 3 loud bangs, then silence. I swallowed, my throat dry. I didn't want to go down there. Every instinct in my body told me to stay put, to ignore it. But I also couldn't just lay there. If it was my parents, they'd wonder why I wasn't answering. If it was someone else. I sat up, forcing myself to move, every muscle in my body tight with nerves. I stepped onto the cold floor, wincing, and slowly made my way to my bedroom door. I opened it as quietly as I could, stepping into the dark hallway. The house felt different now. The warmth from earlier was gone, replaced by something colder, emptier. I walked carefully to the top of the stairs, looking down. The Christmas tree lights still glowed softly, but they did nothing to make me feel better. I hesitated, then took a deep breath and started down. Each step felt too loud, like I was announcing my presence to whoever was outside. When I reached the bottom, I stood still for a second, listening. Nothing. The house was silent again. I crept to the front door, my heart still pounding. I reached out, hesitating before unlocking it. My hands were sweating. Slowly, I turned the handle and pulled the door open just a crack. Nothing. The porch was empty. The snow outside was undisturbed. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there at all. I stood there for a second, confused, then quickly shut the door and locked it again. My body still felt tense, every part of me on edge. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it had been something falling outside, a branch from a tree or something. I turned away, heading back toward the stairs, but then, the banging again. This time, it was followed by a voice. I couldn't make out the words. It was low, hushed, like someone talking to themselves just outside the door. My stomach dropped. I felt frozen, unsure what to do. And then I heard the growling. Deep, low, and rumbling. We didn't have a dog. I turned slowly, my body rigid. The sound wasn't coming from inside. It was outside, near the front door. The growl was followed by more muffled talking. My ears strained, trying to make out the words, but I couldn't. I backed away, my breath coming faster now. My whole body was screaming at me to get upstairs, to hide, to do something other than stand there. And then I heard the window smash. Glass shattering, the unmistakable sound of something breaking inside the house. I didn't think. I ran. I sprinted up the stairs, my feet barely touching the steps. I dove into my room, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. My breath was coming too fast now, my chest rising and falling in panicked gasps. Downstairs, I heard heavy thudding. Someone moving through the house. The sound of things being knocked over, shifted around. The growling, the voice, all of it mixed together. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I curled up under my blanket, pressing my hands over my ears, trying to block out the sounds. My heart felt like it was going to explode. And then nothing. Silence. I lay there, every muscle locked in fear, waiting for something, anything. But there was nothing. I don't know when I fell asleep. Maybe my body just shut down from exhaustion, or maybe I passed out from fear. But when I woke up the next morning, nothing. The house was perfectly fine. The window wasn't broken. The furniture wasn't moved. No footprints in the snow. No signs that anyone had been there at all. It was like nothing had happened. But I knew what I heard. I knew what I felt. And I never forgot it. We arrived at the camp on a bright, warm afternoon. The kind where the sun feels heavy on your skin, but not quite unbearable. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. And the place had that deep, quiet stillness you only get far away from cities. The camp itself wasn't anything fancy. Just a handful of wooden cabins arranged in a rough circle, with a larger building for meals and activities. Beyond the cabins, there was a fire pit surrounded by logs for sitting, and past that, the tree line stretched out in every direction. It was isolated, surrounded by nothing but deep forest. Our class was excited, buzzing with energy as we unpacked our bags and checked out our cabins. Inside, they were about what you'd expect. Bunk beds lined up against the walls, thin mattresses and small, rectangular windows near the top of the walls to let in some light. There were no curtains, just blinds that could be pulled down at night. The place smelled like old wood and damp fabric, like it had been through years of rain and sweaty campers. Each night after dinner, the camp staff would take us to the fire pit and tell scary stories. They had a whole collection, legends about the area, some about creatures in the woods, others about old campers who had gone missing. The stories were fun, but nothing ever really stuck with me. I always figured they were just there to freak us out a little before bed. But there was one story they never told. It was our third night at camp when things started feeling off. We had settled into a routine by then, messing around in the cabin before lights out, sneaking glances out the windows to make sure no teachers or staff were patrolling. If the coast was clear, we'd keep goofing off until someone got tired enough to call it a night. That evening was no different. Someone cracked a joke about the fire pit stories, and we laughed about how dumb they were. But as the laughter died down, one of the guys near the front window froze. "There's someone out there," he whispered. We all rushed to the window, pressing our faces against the glass. At first, I couldn't see anything. The area outside was mostly dark, lit only by the dim light from the lodge down the hill. But then I saw him, an old man, standing on a pile of wooden pallets. He wasn't moving, just standing there, his posture rigid, his face shadowed in the dim light. He looked like he was in his 60s or 70s, dressed in dark clothes that blended into the night. The way he stood, so still, so unnatural, made my skin crawl. Someone muttered, "What the hell?" But no one had an answer. We weren't sure if he was watching us, but it felt like he was. After a few minutes of nervous whispers, we pulled the blinds shut. We figured he must have been some worker or local just passing through. Maybe he was stacking those pallets for something. Maybe he was just taking a break. It was weird, sure, but we tried to push it out of our minds. About 10 minutes later, someone suggested checking again. We were all curious, even if we didn't want to admit it. We lifted the blinds just enough to peek outside. He was gone. The pile of pallets was still there, but the man had vanished. A strange, uneasy silence filled the cabin. We all sat back down, trying to shake off the weirdness. It was my turn to check the back window that night. I didn't really want to, but we had a system. Whoever checked one night got a break the next. So after a few minutes, I stood up, walked over, and reached for the blinds. I hesitated for a second before pulling them back. And there he was, his face, inches from the glass. For a split second, I couldn't move. His skin was pale, his eyes dark. Deep wrinkles cut across his face, but his expression was blank, completely empty of emotion. Just staring, motionless. The window was at least 10 to 15 feet off the ground. I scrambled backward, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "Go to bed," I muttered, not even sure if anyone heard me. I pulled the blanket over my head and squeezed my eyes shut, trying to breathe normally. The next morning, I told myself I must have imagined it. The angle of the window, the darkness. Maybe I had just seen a reflection or a trick of the light. But I didn't check the window again for the rest of the trip. We never saw him again. The camp staff never mentioned anything. And when I asked around after we got home, no one else seemed to remember the old man at all. Years later, I still think about that face. The way he stood perfectly still on those pallets, the way he disappeared, and most of all, the way he had been looking in through that window, at a height where no one should have been able to reach. It had been a typical weekend with my friend, just a normal hangout in my dorm room. The kind of weekend you expect with someone you've known for a while. Chill, comfortable, and uneventful. I was still adjusting to life in this old dorm, which was in a 100-year-old house in New England. The creaks and groans of the building were something I had gotten used to, but I always felt a little weird at night, like the house was too old to be entirely safe. I lived on the second floor, and from my window, you could look down at the ivy-covered brick walls of the building below and the darkened streets of town. We had stayed up a little later than we planned, which wasn't unusual. My friend was staying with me for the weekend to celebrate his birthday, and we had been chatting late into the night. It was probably around 3:30 a.m. when we both woke up unexpectedly. It was strange. Neither of us had set an alarm, and there was no sound to wake us. It was just like our eyes opened at the exact same time, and we were both wide awake. At first, I thought it was just a fluke, a weird coincidence, but something felt off. I could tell my friend felt it too, the way his eyes were darting around the room, his body stiff, as if something in the air had shifted. But he didn't say anything, so neither did I. We just laid there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence of the room. The house was quiet at night, almost too quiet, and that made it feel like we were the only two people left in the world. Eventually, we started chatting to pass the time. The conversation shifted, as it often did with us, to the subject of ghosts and things that go bump in the night. I don't know why we started talking about it, but I mentioned that I had always been afraid of ghosts. It was one of those irrational fears, something I couldn't shake, even as an adult. Maybe it was because of all the old stories I had heard growing up, or maybe it was just the house I was living in, so old, with its history and its eerie atmosphere. I didn't know, but ghosts always made me feel uneasy. My friend, who was more logical and skeptical, teased me a bit about my fear. He laughed and said that ghosts weren't real, that it was just something people imagined, especially in old buildings. As he spoke, I tried to brush off my unease, telling myself that ghosts weren't real and that it was just my imagination running wild. But in the back of my mind, a little voice kept whispering that there was something strange about this house, something off about the way it felt when the lights went out. Just as we were getting into the conversation, the lights in the room suddenly cut out. It wasn't gradual. 1 second, the lights were on, and the next they were completely off, plunging the room into darkness. I froze, the sudden change catching me off guard. For a second, I thought maybe it was just a flicker, but no, nothing. The room was black. I waited a moment to see if the power would come back on. It didn't. What just happened? I said, my voice a little shaky. I couldn't help it. My nerves were on edge. My friend didn't seem as freaked out, but I could tell he was a little thrown off. We sat there in the dark for a moment, trying to make sense of it. I tried to stay calm, convincing myself it was just a power surge or something, nothing unusual. But then, I had to check. I didn't know why, but I had to. I wasn't sure if I was just looking for a reason to calm myself down, or if there was something more to it. I got up and walked to the door, opening it slowly. I peered out into the hallway of the dorm. The hallway light was on, and I could hear the soft hum of electricity coming from the other rooms. It was just my room. The only place that had lost power was my bedroom. I felt a cold chill crawl up my spine as I stood there, the quiet of the house amplifying the weirdness of it all. Why was it just my room? Nothing else in the house had gone out. It didn't make sense. I closed the door behind me and went back to my bed, trying to ignore the growing feeling of unease in my chest. My friend and I spent the next little while scrolling through Reddit, trying to distract ourselves, but the silence of the room was almost suffocating. We were both aware of the tension in the air, but we didn't talk about it. It felt better to just pretend nothing was wrong. After a while, the lights flickered back on, and we both let out a quiet sigh of relief. It was almost like nothing had happened. But then, 20 minutes later, the lights went out again, just as abruptly as before. By this point, we were both kind of on edge. I think we were both hoping it would pass, and neither of us wanted to admit that we were freaked out. We decided it would be best to just try to go to sleep, though neither of us said anything about it. I remember pulling the covers over me, trying to block out the weirdness. My friend did the same, but I could tell neither of us was really relaxed. That's when it happened. The room was pitch black, completely devoid of any light. There wasn't even a sliver of moonlight creeping through the window. But I saw something. I don't know how to explain it, but I saw it clearly in the corner of the room, on the opposite wall. It was like the outline of two eyes, glowing faintly, cat-like eyes, with the faintest hint of an amber glow. At first, I thought maybe it was a trick of the darkness, or my mind playing games with me. But then my friend said, "Do you see that?" His voice was quiet, but filled with disbelief. I nodded slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. He saw it too. We both lay there, staring at the eyes. They were in the upper right corner of the room, near where the wall met the ceiling, just barely visible in the dark. I couldn't take my eyes off them. The eyes were unsettling, unnatural. There was something about them that didn't belong. They weren't like any kind of light reflection I had ever seen, not the kind you'd get from a street lamp or a light shining through a crack in the window. No, this was different. These eyes were pure darkness, like they were part of the very fabric of the room. The longer I looked at them, the more uncomfortable I became. The room felt colder. My breath seemed to hang in the air like I had opened a freezer door, and I could feel my body tense up. The eyes didn't move, but they felt alive. They were watching us, even though we couldn't see the rest of the face, only the eyes. The darkness around them seemed to deepen, like the corner of the room was a void, pulling everything in. My friend mentioned that the eyes reminded him of something from his childhood, something he used to see at night in his room. He couldn't explain it, but he said they looked like eyes he would see in the dark when he was young. That made me even more uneasy. Why was it that we both saw them, and why did it feel like they were so close, like they were right there in the room with us? I shut my eyes, trying to block out the image. I squeezed them tight, telling myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting my fears get the best of me. But the feeling didn't go away. I couldn't shake it. Eventually, we both fell into an uneasy sleep, but it wasn't restful. I kept dreaming about the eyes, and every time I woke up, they were still there in the corner of the room, staring at me. When I finally woke up in the morning, the lights were back on, and everything felt normal again, but the memory of the eyes lingered in my mind like a bad taste. That night, I decided to try something. I wanted to know if there was some sort of logical explanation for what we had seen. I didn't want to believe in ghosts or anything like that, so I shut off all the lights and appliances in my room, hoping to recreate the situation. I was hoping to find out that the eyes had been the result of some light leaking in from somewhere, like from a crack in the window or from another room. But when I sat in the darkness and waited, I couldn't find them. The eyes were gone. There was no faint glow, no unsettling shape in the corner. It was just dark, like it should have been. I couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. Maybe I had just let my imagination get the better of me, I thought. Maybe I was just looking for something that wasn't there. But I couldn't forget what I saw that night. It didn't make sense. There was no logical explanation for it. The eyes, the darkness, the way the room had felt, none of it added up. I didn't know what had happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something in that room that wasn't supposed to be there. Something that was watching us, waiting. The night was thick with heat, the kind that clings to your skin no matter how still you sit. It had been a long, boring summer day, and by the time it was well past midnight, I was restless. The air in my room felt stifling, and the occasional breeze from the open window did little to help. I was chatting online with my friend, both of us complaining about how there was nothing to do, how we were sick of just sitting inside, wasting away the summer vacation. Then, on a whim, I suggested something, swimming. It wasn't a totally crazy idea. The lake was only about a 20-minute walk from my house, tucked deep into the forest. We had gone there plenty of times before, though never this late. But it was summer, the water would be warm, and we had nothing better to do. The more I thought about it, the more it seemed like a good idea. My friend agreed. We met up just outside my house, the neighborhood completely silent, except for the occasional chirp of a cricket. The streetlights cast long, yellowish glows onto the pavement, but past them, everything was just darkness. The kind of darkness that makes you realize how alone you really are when the world is sleeping. Neither of us spoke much as we entered the forest. The trees were thick, their branches forming a tangled ceiling overhead that blocked out what little light the moon provided. Without streetlights, without houses or cars, the dark here felt different. Deeper, more suffocating. We had flashlights with us, but we kept them off to let our eyes adjust. The dirt path was familiar, packed down from years of use, though at this hour, every rustle in the undergrowth, every crack of a twig, felt amplified. The night was humid, but the air inside the forest was cooler than it had been in my house. I could hear the sounds of insects, the occasional hoot of an owl, but otherwise, it was dead silent. Our footsteps barely made a sound against the dirt. We reached the lake, stepping out from the cover of the trees onto the rocky shoreline. The water was completely still, reflecting the moon in a broken, rippling way. There was no wind, no movement at all. Just silence. The forest behind us felt like it was watching. We stripped down to our swimming shorts and left our clothes in a pile a few feet from the water's edge. I set my flashlight down, propped up so it was pointing towards the lake. That way, once we swam out, we'd be able to see where we left our stuff and find our way back. The light cast a bright white beam, cutting through the darkness. I hesitated for a second before stepping into the water. I wasn't a strong swimmer, and deep water had always freaked me out. Something about not being able to see what was beneath me, what might be lurking just beyond my reach, had always made my chest tighten. But I pushed those thoughts down and waded in, feeling the cool water rise up my legs, then my waist, until finally I pushed off and started swimming. My friend was already ahead, moving effortlessly through the water. We swam out about 50 meters, the shore shrinking behind us. Treading water, I turned back toward the light. It was a strange feeling, being out here in the middle of the night. The silence was heavy, and I could feel the water shifting around me, moving in slow, lazy ripples. Then the light flickered. It went out for a second, then came back on, then off again, then on, like someone had walked in front of it. My stomach clenched. I was already uncomfortable being out this far in the dark, but this was something else. The flashlight hadn't moved. It was still propped up exactly as I had left it, and yet something had passed in front of it. I stayed frozen, barely keeping my head above the water, my breath coming in short, uneven bursts. The silence was absolute. No wind, no rustling, no sound at all. I wasn't sure how much time passed, but after what felt like forever, nothing else happened. The light stayed steady. The shore looked the same as before. Maybe it had been nothing. Maybe an insect had flown past, or a trick of the water had made it look like something moved. I wanted to get back. We started swimming toward the shore, not fast enough to seem panicked, but faster than before. My arms burned, my chest ached, but I kept going. Every few seconds, I would glance up at the light, making sure it was still there, making sure nothing else moved. Reaching the shallows, I stumbled onto the rocky shore, water streaming off me. My hands were shaking. I grabbed my towel, drying off as fast as I could, my ears straining for any sound in the woods. Then I saw it, right next to the flashlight. A shoe. It wasn't mine. It wasn't my friend's. And it hadn't been there when we arrived. I stared at it, my mind racing. It was old, worn, half covered in dirt. A single shoe. I didn't want to touch it. I didn't want to look at it. I wanted to get out of there. We grabbed our stuff, barely bothering to finish drying off, throwing our clothes back on as fast as possible. I turned off the flashlight and shoved it into my bag. The darkness swallowed us instantly. The walk back through the forest was the longest 20 minutes of my life. I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind us, to see something moving in the trees, to feel something reaching out from the dark. But there was nothing, just silence. We made it back to my house, stepping into the safety of the dim streetlights. My heart was still pounding, my skin still damp. We didn't talk about it for a long time. Not that night, not the next day, not for weeks. But every so often, we'd bring it up. And every time, the feeling came back. The cold, creeping feeling that someone had been there. Watching, waiting, and the shoe. That old, dirty shoe. I don't go to that lake anymore. I've had my share of strange experiences in my life, but the one that happened recently still lingers with me. I can't shake it. Maybe it's because it happened in a place I thought I knew, or maybe it's because I wasn't prepared for it. I've told a few people here and there, but the looks they give me when I say it, the doubt in their eyes, it makes me feel like I'm the one losing my mind. Right now, my family is staying with my parents while we search for a house to buy. We've been living here for a couple of months now. My parents bought this place a couple of years ago. It was a foreclosure. When they first stepped inside, it was a complete disaster. Everything was trashed. I remember the first time I walked through the door after they got the keys. It felt wrong, like something had been left behind, like the house had a memory, and it wasn't a good one. We've all been remodeling it ever since, tearing down walls, pulling up carpets, fixing the foundation. The house looks better now, but you can still see the remnants of its past. Broken windows, old stab marks on the doors, graffiti scratched into the walls. I'll never forget what I found on the upstairs bedroom door. "I hate you, bitch," it said. "You deserve to die." There were similar messages all over the house, just waiting for someone to find them. From what I've been told, the people who lived here before were violent. They were abusive to their animals, to each other. I've heard stories about their horses, goats, about how they were neglected, starved even. The whole place just felt like it carried that energy. One day, I was home alone. The kids were out with my husband, and I was upstairs putting clothes away in one of the bedrooms. It was a peaceful afternoon. The air outside was still, and the house was quiet except for the faint creaks of the wood. I didn't think anything of it when I first heard it, a soft voice, almost like a whisper. At first, I thought maybe it was the TV downstairs, but then I remembered the kids weren't even home. I tried to ignore it, but something about it stuck with me. The voice wasn't loud or threatening, just calm, almost casual. "You need to get out of here." At first, I tried to shake it off. I was probably just imagining things. I kept putting clothes away, focusing on the task. But after a few minutes, I realized something. There was no TV on. There was no one else in the house with me. The doors were all closed, locked, and I hadn't heard anyone come in. I walked over to the hallway and double-checked, but everything was the same. It didn't make sense. I didn't know what to think. Was it a fluke? Was it the wind, or something else that could explain it? It wasn't the first time I'd experienced something strange like that. I've had these kinds of things happen before. Once when I was younger, and another time when I was living in an apartment by myself. But I've never gotten used to it. I couldn't stay inside after that. I grabbed my dog's leash and took him for a walk around the block. I didn't want to be alone in that house. I didn't want to be anywhere near it. My heart was pounding in my chest, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized how freaked out I was. I walked for almost an hour, just trying to get my mind off of it, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next few days went by like normal, but it wasn't long before things started happening again. One night, my husband and I were in bed. It was late, and we were both trying to sleep. The kids were down for the night, and the house was still. We had just turned off the lights when I heard my husband speak, almost calmly. "The door just opened," he said. My first reaction was panic. My heart jumped into my throat, and I immediately sat up, but before I could say anything, he added, "And now it just closed." I froze. I didn't know what to think. Our bedroom door had opened fully, then shut again, all on its own. There was no breeze, no draft, nothing that could have explained it. I lay there, wide-eyed, staring at the door in the dark, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it. What was going on? Was I losing it? Was it the house, something about it? Or was it just us? Was I just imagining things? But it didn't feel like it. It felt real. It felt terrifyingly real. The next day, I didn't mention anything to anyone. I tried to brush it off. But when I got home later in the afternoon, my mom greeted me at the door with a worried look on her face. She didn't know anything about what had happened the night before, but what she said next caught my attention. "I kept hearing someone coughing upstairs," she said, her voice tight. I went up to check, but there was nobody there. It was like a bad cough, a dry one. And then when I came back downstairs, I could hear a baby crying. I went up again, but no one was there. It sounded like it was coming from the nursery, but the room was empty. I didn't know what to say. I couldn't help but think of the weird things we had been experiencing in the house lately. It was too much of a coincidence. I didn't even know how to explain it to her, so I just stayed quiet. My mom didn't seem scared, though. She just seemed confused. She didn't know what to make of it. Neither did I. But I wasn't about to ignore it. Something was definitely going on in that house. The last straw came when we were out for the day. My parents were at the house, alone. I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary to happen while we were gone. But when I came home, my mom seemed unsettled. She told me she'd been hearing odd things, and I knew it wasn't just her imagination. She wasn't one to be overly dramatic, and I could tell that whatever had happened earlier was bothering her. When I asked her about it in more detail, she just shook her head and gave me a look that said she didn't want to talk about it. But I knew she had heard something. What was going on in that house? Why were these things happening? For a while, I didn't know what to think. I didn't know what to believe. Was there something in the house? Or was it all just in our heads? I started to doubt myself. Maybe I was letting my imagination get the best of me, just like everyone always says. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. Something wasn't right. The house had a history, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened here before was still lingering. I decided to do some research, just to see if anyone else had experienced anything similar. I went online, searched through old local news stories, and talked to a few people who'd lived around here for years. That's when I found out more about the house's past. The previous owners, those violent, abusive people, had a dark history. There were whispers of strange things happening in the house, too. Things like whispers at night, objects moving on their own, and the general sense that the house had a bad energy. But nobody could explain why. I don't know what I believe anymore. All I know is that something is going on, and it's hard to ignore. It's like the house is holding on to its past, keeping the memories of its violent history alive in ways I can't explain. Maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm seeing things, hearing things that aren't there. But whatever it is, it's real to me. We're still staying here, but I'm not sure for how much longer. The house is getting better, little by little, but the odd things keep happening. We've started locking all the doors at night, checking everything twice before we go to bed. And the moments when the house goes quiet, when the world outside is still. Those are the times when I feel like something is watching me, listening to me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's just the house, or if there's something more to it. All I know is that I can't ignore it anymore. And I don't think I ever will. The house may have a history of its own, but it's becoming part of ours now, whether we like it or not. The question is, what happens when it finally decides to reveal all of its secrets? I never liked the apartment much to begin with. It was small, the walls were thin, and the whole building had a rundown feeling, like it had been patched together over the years instead of properly maintained. The carpet was the kind that always felt dirty, no matter how much I vacuumed, and the kitchen cabinets had that slight greasy film that came from years of people cooking cheap meals in a poorly ventilated space. But it was what I could afford, and that was all that mattered. The neighborhood wasn't much better. It wasn't the worst part of the city, but it wasn't good either. The kind of place where you heard yelling at night, but kept your blinds closed, where people lingered too long on street corners, and the store clerks all worked behind thick glass. I tried not to think too much about it. I worked, I came home, I locked my doors. That was the routine. At first, it was just a feeling. The kind that crept in quietly. The way your stomach sinks a little when you think you've forgotten something important. I'd come home from work, and something would feel off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I'd stand there in the doorway for just a second longer than normal, scanning the room, waiting for my brain to catch up with whatever my gut was trying to tell me. But there was nothing. The door was locked. The windows were shut. Everything looked the same. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it was just because I was smoking more than usual. I'd come home, roll a joint, and try to relax, but that nagging feeling never really went away. I started checking the locks more often, double-checking the windows before bed, making sure nothing was out of place. Then it started getting worse. One day, I noticed the magnets on my fridge were rearranged. Nothing big, just small shifts, like they had been bumped. I assumed I had done it without thinking, maybe while reaching for something. But the next time it happened, I knew I hadn't touched them. And then new ones appeared. They were cheap advertisement magnets, the kind businesses hand out for free. But they weren't from anywhere local. Different state. I didn't know how they got there. I stood in my kitchen staring at them for a long time, trying to remember if someone had left them on my fridge, if maybe I had grabbed them by accident from somewhere. But there was nothing. I told my friends, but they just laughed. They said I was too high, that I was just forgetting things. I wanted to believe them. I really did. But I started paying closer attention. That's when I saw the cigarette butts. I don't smoke cigarettes. Some of my friends did, but we always smoked outside. There was an ashtray on my little balcony, but it was always just roaches and ash. Then one night I came home, and there were cigarette butts in there. Not just 1 or 2, 4, maybe 5. And they weren't my friends' brands. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. The air felt different, heavier. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been standing in that exact spot not long before I got home. That was it. That was the moment it all clicked. I wasn't just being paranoid. Someone had been inside. Someone had been in my home. I told the cops. They didn't care. They let me file a report, but it was obvious they weren't going to do anything. There was no forced entry. No evidence. Just my word and a handful of cigarette butts. My friends still weren't convinced. They told me it was nothing, that I was working myself up over nothing. But I knew better, so I decided to prove it. One night, I borrowed my boyfriend's car and parked it a few blocks away. If whoever was coming into my apartment thought I wasn't home, maybe they'd come back. I locked the doors, turned off all the lights, and waited. The first half hour was nothing. Just the usual sounds of the building settling, the distant noise of the city outside. But then something changed. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't something I saw. It was just a feeling, a deep, gut-level certainty that I needed to leave. Right now. I didn't question it. I grabbed my keys and slipped out of my apartment as quickly and quietly as I could. I didn't stop to grab anything. I didn't look back. I just moved. It wasn't until I reached the car that I turned around. And that's when I saw it. A dark figure climbing onto my balcony. He was huge, his silhouette black against the dim city lights. He moved with slow, deliberate movements, like he had done this before. Like he knew exactly what he was doing. I sat frozen in my car, watching. My apartment was on the second floor. He had climbed up the side of the building like it was nothing. I could see him peering into my dark apartment, checking to see if I was home. I drove away. I didn't stop. I didn't go back. The next morning, I called my landlord, broke my lease, and packed whatever I could fit into my car. I moved out that same day. A few weeks later, I heard that another woman in the building had woken up in the middle of the night to find a man standing in her bedroom. She hadn't been so lucky. I used to think things like that only happened in movies. I used to think if you locked your doors, you were safe. But the truth is, locks only keep out the people who respect them. It was around 5 a.m. during the summer, just before the first light of dawn. I hadn't really slept the night before, as usual. I spent hours playing video games, browsing the internet, and losing track of time. I always did this when I couldn't sleep, especially during the summer when the days were longer, and everything outside was quiet and still. The room was dark, lit only by the glow of my computer screen, but I didn't mind. I didn't even think about the time until I heard the familiar footsteps on the stairs. The sound of my mom's footsteps was always something I recognized. They were heavy, deliberate, like someone who didn't need to be sneaky. I immediately knew it was her coming up the stairs, and I froze. I had a feeling she was about to come into my room and tell me to get some rest, as she usually did when she knew I was up late. But this time, I was already in bed, pretending to sleep just to avoid the lecture. I kept my eyes barely open, peeking through the thin slits between my eyelids. She reached the top of the stairs, and I heard her footsteps slow as she walked down the hallway. She walked right past my door. I could hear her breathing lightly, the soft creaking of the floorboards under her weight. But then something strange happened. She didn't stop at my room. I could hear the faint sound of her hand on the doorknob of the room across the hallway. I squinted, still pretending to sleep, unsure of what was happening. Normally, my mom never went into that room. The door to that room was always shut, and the only time she ever went in there was to ask me to go to bed if I was up too late. But tonight, she didn't just pass by. She went into that room. I held my breath, watching the light from the hallway bleed under the door, outlining her silhouette. She opened the door and stepped inside, closing it behind her with a soft click. There was no sound of her footsteps retreating, no movement after that. For about 5 minutes, everything was still, almost too still. I couldn't hear her talking to anyone or moving around. Nothing. It felt wrong, like something didn't quite add up. I couldn't figure out what was going on. After those 5 minutes, a strange, uncomfortable feeling crept over me. I felt like I had to know what was happening. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't just lie there anymore, waiting to find out. I pushed the blanket aside and slowly slid out of bed, trying to keep quiet. The room was dark, with only the dim moonlight filtering through the window. I tiptoed across the floor, my bare feet making no sound on the carpet. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the door to the room my mom had gone into. I hesitated for a moment, hand hovering just above the doorknob. My mind was racing. What was she doing in there? Why wasn't she coming out? I was almost certain that she was the one I had seen walk past my door. The door had clicked shut, the kind of noise that would have only come from someone closing it. But when I reached for the doorknob, everything in my gut told me something was wrong. I twisted the knob slowly, pushing the door open a crack. The hinges squeaked softly, and I winced at the noise. I didn't want to make a sound, but I couldn't stop myself. The door crept open until there was enough space for me to peer inside. I held my breath, eyes scanning the darkness of the room. It was empty. The room was as still and quiet as ever, just like it always was when I wasn't inside. The lights were off, and there was no movement, no sign that anyone had been in there at all. My heart sank, and a cold sweat broke out on my palms. The room felt too empty, too silent. It didn't make sense. My mind struggled to make sense of what I had just witnessed. There had been someone walking into this room just moments ago. I had seen them with my own eyes. I could even picture the way she closed the door behind her. But now nothing. No one. I stepped into the room, my mind racing. I looked around, trying to find any clues, any signs that would explain what had just happened. There was nothing. No broken items, no footprints on the floor, not even the faintest hint of disturbance. Everything was as it always was. The curtains hung motionless at the window, the dresser stood in its usual spot, and the bed was made neatly untouched. I closed the door behind me slowly, the sound of it clicking shut echoing in the silence of the room. I didn't know what I was supposed to think. I was certain that my mom had been there. I saw her walk into this room. I heard her close the door. But now there was no trace of her. It was as if she had never been here at all. I walked back to my own room, my feet moving as if on autopilot. I climbed back into bed, pulling the covers up over my head, trying to shake the feeling of dread that had settled deep in my chest. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had just experienced. My mind kept looping through the events, trying to find a logical explanation, but there was nothing that made sense. It felt like my brain was playing tricks on me, like I had imagined the whole thing. But the memory of seeing my mom walk past the door, of hearing the door close behind her, was too real to ignore. I lay there in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sound that might break the silence. The quiet was unbearable, and the feeling of unease was heavy in the room. My palms were sweating, and my chest felt tight as I tried to calm my breathing. Minutes passed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I wanted to go check on my mom, to see if she was okay, but I couldn't bring myself to leave the safety of my bed. My mind kept telling me that I was just imagining things, that it had all been a figment of my tired mind. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. I couldn't let go of the image of her walking past my door, entering that room, and then the strange emptiness that followed. I finally fell into a restless sleep, my dreams filled with the same empty room, the same feeling of unease. When I woke up later that morning, the sun had just begun to rise. The room was bathed in soft light, and the normal sounds of the house returned. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of birds chirping outside. I got up and walked downstairs, still trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. My mom was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee like nothing had happened. She looked up at me and gave me a smile, but I couldn't bring myself to ask her about the night before. It felt stupid, like I was imagining things. I went about my morning routine, trying to act normal, but the memory of what had happened lingered in the back of my mind. I never brought it up to my mom, not because I didn't want to, but because I couldn't explain it. It didn't make sense to her, and I wasn't sure I could even make sense of it myself. Every time I thought about it, I felt that same knot in my stomach, that same sense of wrongness. It's been years since that night, but every time I'm home alone, I can't help but think about what happened. The feeling still creeps up on me, and sometimes late at night, when everything is quiet, I find myself glancing at that room across the hall, wondering if I'll ever get an answer. I was 14 when it happened. It was a normal day, bright and clear, the kind where everything feels ordinary. I was sitting at my computer, playing Command & Conquer, Tiberian Sun, completely lost in the game. The setup of the room meant that my back was to the front door, which was made of glass. It wasn't a big deal. I had lived in that house long enough to know that no one ever really came by unannounced. The street was quiet, a typical suburban neighborhood where nothing much ever happened. I remember how focused I was on the game. The clicking of the mouse, the hum of the computer, the occasional sound of birds outside. It was all just background noise. But then something changed. I can't explain it in a way that makes sense. It was like the air in the room thickened, like something heavy settled over me. The light coming in from the windows didn't seem as bright anymore, even though I knew it was still the middle of the day. That feeling, the one that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, hit me hard. It wasn't fear at first. It was more like a deep, sinking sense of something being wrong. The kind of feeling that makes your body react before your mind can even process what's happening. I stopped clicking, stopped moving, just sat there, frozen. Something was watching me. I don't know how I knew, but I knew. That's when my instincts kicked in, and I slowly turned my head to look at the front door. There, standing just beside it, was a figure. It was tall, too tall. The door itself was of normal height, but this thing had to bend at an angle to even peer through the glass. Its head tilted sideways, as if it was adjusting itself just to look at me. My eyes locked onto it, taking in its shape. It wore something heavy, like a coat or a long jacket, and an old-fashioned hat, the kind you'd see in pictures from 100 years ago. But what stood out the most was its color. It wasn't just dark, it was pitch black, like a hole where no light existed. I couldn't see any facial features. No eyes, no mouth, no details at all. But I knew, I don't know how, but I knew it was looking directly at me. My chest tightened. My breath caught in my throat. Every instinct told me not to move, like prey caught in the sights of a predator. I couldn't hear anything except the blood rushing in my ears. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I wanted to move, but I couldn't. Instead, I did the only thing my body would allow. I turned away. I snapped my head back to the computer screen, forcing my eyes onto the game, but my hands wouldn't move. My heart was pounding so hard that I thought I might pass out. Seconds stretched into what felt like forever. I had to look again. Slowly, stiffly, I turned my head back toward the door. It was gone. There was nothing there. No shadow, no movement, no sign that anything had been there at all. The street outside looked exactly the same as it always did. Sunlight poured over the pavement. The trees swayed slightly in the breeze. It was as if nothing had happened. But I knew what I had seen. I stayed frozen in my chair for what felt like an eternity, listening, waiting. My ears strained for the sound of footsteps, of rustling, of anything. But there was nothing. Just the soft hum of my computer, the distant sound of cars passing by, and the birds outside. Slowly, I forced myself to move. My body was stiff, my muscles locked up from tension. I reached out, hesitated, then pressed my hand against the desk to steady myself. I turned fully toward the door this time, half expecting something to be there again. Still nothing. I hesitated for a long moment before I stood up, my legs shaky beneath me. I wasn't sure what I was doing, but my body felt like it needed to move, like sitting still would somehow make whatever had just happened real. I forced myself to step toward the door. Each step felt heavy, my mind screaming at me to stop. But I needed to know. When I finally reached the door, I hesitated again before leaning forward slightly, just enough to look out. My breath was still shaky, my hands clammy. I pressed my palm against the cool glass, searching, scanning the street, the sidewalk, the yard. There was nothing, no sign of anyone. I swallowed hard and turned the knob, slowly opening the door. The warm air of the afternoon hit my face, but I barely registered it. I took one step outside, looking around, my ears straining for any sound that didn't belong. Nothing. I stepped further out, glancing at the ground. If someone had been standing there would be some sign, right? A footprint? A shadow? Something. But there was nothing. I glanced toward the driveway, then to the side of the house. My gut told me I wouldn't find anything, but I still took a few steps, looking around. Still nothing. I stood there for a long time, feeling like I was going crazy. My mind was trying to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe it was just a salesman, someone passing by, some trick of the light. Maybe my mind had played a trick on me. But I knew better. Something about that figure wasn't right. The height, the way it bent to look through the glass, the way it was too dark, like it absorbed the light around it. And most of all, the way it had been watching me. I stood there until I couldn't anymore, then slowly walked back inside. My stomach felt twisted, my skin cold despite the warmth of the day. I closed the door, locking it even though I had never really felt the need to before. I sat back down at my computer, staring at the screen. The game was still running, but I couldn't focus. My body felt drained, my mind racing. I didn't tell anyone. What would I even say? That I saw something impossible? That I felt something staring at me, something that shouldn't exist? No one would believe me, but I believed me. For days after, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. Every time I sat at my computer, I felt that heaviness settle over me again. I would glance over my shoulder constantly, checking the door, the windows, everything. I kept the blinds shut from then on. I never sat with my back to the door again. And even though I never saw it again, I never forgot. Because whatever it was, whoever it was, asterisk, it had seen me too star. I was 10 years old when it happened, just a kid lying in bed, waiting for sleep to pull me under. My room was dark, the only light coming from a faint glow under the door, maybe from the hallway or the bathroom nightlight. I don't remember if I was scared before I fell asleep. Probably not. It was just another night like any other. The house was quiet, my parents were in their room, my brother in his. Everything was normal. Sleep came fast, or at least it felt that way. And with sleep came the dream. It wasn't like the usual dreams I had. I didn't find myself flying or running through strange places. It wasn't one of those dreams that make no sense, where people shift into different faces, where one moment you're at school, the next you're in some weird version of your house that doesn't quite look right. This dream was clear, solid. I was in my room. It was dark, but not quite the same as in real life. The walls seemed closer, the shadows heavier. I could make out my bed, the dresser, the slightly open closet door. But something was off. And then I saw him, my brother, or at least something that looked like him. He was standing by my bed, looking down at me. There was something wrong with his face, something in his expression. It wasn't quite anger. It wasn't sadness. Just wrong. Dark. I wanted to speak, to ask him what he was doing there, but before I could, he moved. His hands were on my throat. I couldn't breathe. The pressure was instant, like iron bands tightening around my neck. I tried to grab at his wrists, to push him away, but he was too strong. My lungs burned. My chest screamed for air. I thrashed, kicked, tried to scream, but nothing came out. The room blurred, darkness creeping in from the edges. My ears rang. I was dying. And then I woke up. Relief flooded through me. That instant realization that it was all a dream, that I was safe in my bed, was overwhelming. My heart was still pounding, my skin damp with sweat, but I was awake. It was over. I sucked in a deep breath, expecting the cool, familiar rush of air to fill my lungs, to push away the last of the nightmare. Nothing. No air. No relief. I tried again. Nothing. Panic hit me like a truck. My body locked up. My hands clenched the blankets. My chest was still rising and falling, but it wasn't working. There was no air going in, nothing filling my lungs. I was suffocating. It didn't feel like holding my breath. It wasn't that slow, steady burn you get when you try to see how long you can last underwater. It was immediate. Wrong. My throat felt tight, like something was clamping down on it from the inside. My lungs felt useless, like they weren't even mine anymore. I was gasping, trying to force something in, but it wasn't working. I clawed at my throat, rolled onto my side, trying anything, but nothing changed. My body was screaming for oxygen. My vision blurred. I tried to sit up, but my limbs were weak, shaking. I was going to die. I could feel it. Not the childish fear of something hiding in the closet. Not the distant worry of what might happen. This was real. This was my body shutting down. This was the end. I don't know if I made a noise. Maybe I did. Maybe my breathing was loud enough, wheezing and rasping in a way that wasn't normal. Maybe my bed creaked as I thrashed. Or maybe something in the house was just quiet enough at the right moment for him to hear me. Because suddenly my dad was there. I didn't see him come in. One moment, I was drowning in open air, alone in my bed. The next, he was next to me, pulling me up, guiding me out of the room. My legs barely worked. I don't even remember how I got downstairs. I was too far gone to think, too consumed by the terror, by the simple, overwhelming fact that I couldn't breathe. Somehow, he got me to the living room. The lights were on, too bright. The air felt different down here, cooler, easier to move through. But I still couldn't get any of it into my lungs. I must have been shaking because I could feel my dad's hands on my shoulders, grounding me, keeping me from completely falling apart. I don't remember words, but I remember the way he moved, the way he stayed close, steady. The panic didn't fade right away. It stayed sharp and consuming. Even as I sat on the couch, my body still fighting, still trying. It took what felt like forever before something shifted. Before my throat loosened, before my lungs managed to catch something just enough. A tiny sip of air, then another. Not enough to feel normal, but enough to remind me that I wasn't dying. My heart was still hammering. My hands were clenched into fists, my legs drawn up close. My whole body ached, like I'd run for miles without stopping. It wasn't until later that I fully understood what had happened. It was an asthma attack. I had them before, but never like this. Never in the middle of the night. Never right after a dream that already had my body in a panic. It was like my mind had tricked me into thinking I was suffocating, and then my body had decided to make it real. It happened again after that. Not the same exact way, but close. Enough that I learned to recognize the signs. Enough that I knew the next time that I wasn't actually dying, even if it felt like it. But that first time, that was different. Because for those long, terrible moments, I truly believed that I was going to die, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I wasn't feeling great the night before. My stomach was acting up, my head was foggy, and I just felt drained. When I told my parents I was going to stay home from school, they didn't argue. My mom had to be out of the house before dawn anyway, and my dad always left shortly after waking me up, so I was usually the last one out. This morning wasn't any different, except I wasn't going anywhere. I was half awake when I heard my dad moving around. The usual morning sounds. Footsteps. The garage door. The sound of his car starting up. It was automatic, part of my daily background noise, and I barely registered it before rolling over and drifting back to sleep. At some point, maybe 15 minutes later, maybe more, I was woken up again by heavy thumping sounds. Not small, subtle noises like creaky floorboards or the hum of the fridge kicking on. Loud, deliberate thuds. For a second, I thought my dad had come back. Maybe he forgot something. Maybe he knocked over his work bag or was shuffling through drawers looking for his keys. He wasn't the quietest person when he was in a hurry. But then it kept going. Thump. Scrape. A drawer slamming shut. More thumping. More noise. I lay there, my body warm and sluggish under the covers, my mind too groggy to think much of it. It was annoying, but not enough to make me get up. If my dad had come back for something, he'd be gone again soon. I let my eyes close and let myself sink back into sleep, the noises fading into the background. By the time I woke up for real, it was around noon. My room was dim, the curtains keeping most of the light out. My head still felt a little foggy, but the sleep had helped. I rolled onto my side, stretched a little, and reached for my phone to check the time. No messages, no missed calls, just silence. I kicked off my blanket and sat up slowly, rubbing my eyes. My stomach still felt off, but I was more hungry than sick now. I thought about making some toast, maybe some tea. Nothing heavy, just enough to settle my stomach. My bedroom was on the main floor, just down the hall from the living room. As soon as I stepped into the hallway, something felt off. It was that feeling you get when you walk into a room and immediately sense that something isn't right. Like the air is different, like something is out of place, but you don't know what yet. I stepped into the living room and stopped. Drawers were pulled out, cabinet doors left open. Papers, books, and random household junk were scattered across the floor. The couch cushions were shifted, and some of the blankets we kept draped over the back were in a crumpled heap on the floor. I just stood there for a second, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. The mess was so out of place that it didn't even register as a break-in at first. My first thought wasn't someone was in here. It was more like, what the hell happened? Then it clicked. The thumping, the noise. Someone had been in the house. My stomach dropped. I hadn't imagined those sounds. I hadn't dreamed them. While I had been asleep in my room, someone had been tearing through the house. And I had done nothing. My ears were suddenly ringing, my heartbeat loud and fast in my chest. My body wanted to freeze, but my brain screamed at me to listen. Was the house silent? Completely silent? I held my breath. Nothing. No shuffling feet. No creaking floors. No drawers still being searched. Just my own breathing, too loud, too shaky. I wasn't sure how long I stood there. A few seconds, maybe longer. Then I forced myself to move. I needed to put pants on. I didn't even know why that was my first thought, but it was. Maybe it was instinct, something that told me I couldn't run out of the house in just a t-shirt and underwear. I turned and hurried back to my room, my legs feeling shaky. I grabbed the first pair of sweatpants I saw and yanked them on, my hands fumbling, my fingers stiff. I needed to get out. I needed to call someone. My phone was still in my room, but I didn't want to stop long enough to call from inside the house. What if they were still there? What if they had just gone quiet? What if they were hiding in another part of the house, waiting? I felt sick. I walked quickly to the front door, forced myself not to sprint, and yanked it open. The cold air hit me like a slap. It was the middle of the day, the sun was shining, everything outside looked normal. Birds chirping, a car passing by in the distance. But inside my chest, my heartbeat was still erratic, my body still wired with the realization that I had been completely alone while a stranger tore through my home. I walked fast to the neighbor's house, my feet moving before I could even think about what I was doing. Their house was only a few doors down. My legs felt unsteady, my breathing still too fast, but I knocked on their door. They answered quickly, surprised to see me. I told them what happened as calmly as I could, but my voice felt weird, like it wasn't mine, like I was speaking from outside of myself. They let me in and handed me their phone to call the police. The waiting was the worst part. Sitting there, not knowing. When the police finally arrived, they checked the house. The burglar was long gone. The only real sign of forced entry was a broken window on the porch. Whoever it was, they hadn't stolen much. No electronics. No jewelry. The only thing missing was cash. They had even dumped out a jar of coins my parents used to collect spare change, sorting out the pennies from the bigger coins, taking only what was worth carrying. That meant they had time. That meant they had been here long enough to sit and pick through coins. The thought made my skin crawl. And then I realized something even worse. They had used my backpack, the one I always left by the door. They had taken everything out of it, my notebooks, my pens, my Kleenex from the front pouch, and had used it to carry away the money. They had taken their time. They had made themselves comfortable. They had been in my house while I was there, and I had been asleep. I felt sick when I thought about it later. What if I had woken up and walked into the living room? What if I had seen them? What if they had seen me? But I hadn't. I had stayed in bed. I had slept through most of it, and that might have saved me. For days afterward, the what-ifs didn't leave me alone. Every little sound in the house made me jump. Every creak of the floor, every distant thump, sent my heart racing. My parents were shaken too. Even though nothing huge was taken, even though there was no real damage beyond the mess and the broken window, the thought of it, of what could have happened, stayed with us. Eventually, the house went back to normal. The mess was cleaned up, the window was fixed. But for a long time, I found myself lying in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering how long the burglar had been there. Wondering if they had ever glanced down the hall toward my room. Wondering what would have happened if I had gotten up. And every time I thought about it, I was grateful for one thing, that I had stayed asleep. I was very young, maybe 5 or 6 when this happened. Back then, I had this routine of going to bed really early, around 6 or 7 at night. It wasn't that I was particularly tired, but I just liked to get under the covers and let the day wind down. My parents had a pretty structured bedtime, which they insisted on even though I didn't always need it. Because of this, I often found myself waking up in the middle of the night. The house was always quiet then, with only the sound of the faintest creaks from the old wooden floorboards echoing in the stillness. That night was no different. I woke up and found myself in the dark room, staring at the ceiling. The moonlight barely crept through the slats of the blinds, and I felt the cool air brushing against my skin. I turned to the side to check the clock, but it was too dark to read. I squinted for a moment, then shrugged. I felt wide awake, and my mind started drifting to the toys that were scattered on the floor next to my bed. I wasn't scared, just bored. The room felt safe, and the silence seemed comforting. So, I decided it was time to play. I reached for my favorite toys, the little plastic animals, the army men, and the miniature dolls. I grabbed them and arranged them in a circle around me on the bed. I was alone, and I had the freedom to make up whatever stories I wanted, so I began pretending I was reading to them. I used the book I'd been reading before bed, flipping through its pages, making up words for the pictures. The toys sat quietly, their little plastic eyes staring back at me. They were good listeners, and I felt important as I told them the story, spinning it into something wild and funny. I loved these little moments of freedom where my imagination could take me anywhere. As I reached the end of the book, I glanced around at my toys to make sure they understood the conclusion of the story. I looked first to the right, then moved my gaze across the circle to the left. That's when something caught my eye. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but there it was. From the crack between the wall and the side of my bed, something moved. At first, I thought it might have been a shadow or just my imagination playing tricks. But then I saw it more clearly. A hand. It wasn't just any hand. It was large, adult-sized, and slowly rising from the crack. I froze, unable to look away. The hand was unnaturally still for a moment, just hovering in the air. Its fingers were long, unnaturally so, like they had been stretched out. The fingers were slightly curled, and I noticed something else, something that made my stomach twist into knots. The hand wasn't like a normal hand. It didn't look like human skin. No, it was made of wood, the same dark brown color as the hardwood floor beneath me. It wasn't like any hand I had ever seen. It wasn't fleshy or warm. It looked rigid, rough, as though it had been carved from the same wood as the floorboards in my room. The more I stared at it, the less real it seemed, and yet there it was, rising from the crack between the wall and the bed. The strange wooden fingers curled slowly, like they were testing the air. I felt my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't scream, couldn't move. It was as if my body was frozen, locked in place by sheer terror. I felt like I was caught in some dream, but I knew this wasn't a dream. I blinked several times, hoping it would go away, but the hand stayed there, slowly, almost deliberately inching upward. Then, as if sensing my gaze, the hand slowly retreated back under the bed, vanishing from sight. My breath caught in my throat. I sat there, staring at the dark crack, waiting for it to appear again, but it didn't. I was so terrified that I couldn't even bring myself to look away from that spot. I had no idea what that was, or how something like that could even exist. I waited, every second feeling like an eternity. The room was still, nothing moving. Nothing except for the wild pounding of my heart. I felt the air in the room grow colder, as though the space around me had shifted into something unfamiliar, something dangerous. I stared at the crack in the floor, willing it not to move, not to show me anything else. After what felt like hours, I couldn't take it anymore. I pushed myself off the bed, my legs trembling beneath me, and I sprinted out of my room. My breath was ragged as I ran through the hallway, my small feet slapping against the cold wood floor. I didn't dare look back. All I wanted was to get away, to escape whatever it was that had been under my bed. I burst into my parents' room and dived into their bed, crying out in fear. I didn't even care if I woke them up. At that moment, I just needed to feel safe. My mother, groggy but awake, immediately wrapped her arms around me, pulling me close. I buried my face into her chest, still trembling. My father, who had been sound asleep, stirred and groaned as he sat up. He blinked at me, then looked at my mother, trying to make sense of the chaos. My mother listened to me as I sobbed, telling her about the hand, how it rose from the crack in the floor, and how it had been made of wood. She didn't laugh, didn't dismiss me. She believed me, despite how impossible it sounded. But my father, he didn't believe a word of it. He kept telling me that it must have been a bad dream, that I must have imagined it. He kept insisting it was just my mind playing tricks, that I'd had a nightmare. But I knew it wasn't a dream. I knew what I saw. It felt so real, so terrifyingly real, that I could still feel the fear crawling down my spine, like it was still there in the room with me. I could still hear my heart racing, feel my body frozen in that moment of fear. No dream had ever felt like that. The days that followed were strange. I didn't want to go back into my room, but I had to. My parents insisted it was all in my head. My father chalked it up to an overactive imagination, especially since I was so young. But something inside me knew that wasn't it. That wasn't a simple trick of the mind. That wasn't just a bad dream. A couple of weeks later, something happened again. I was sitting on my bed one evening, just looking out the window, when I saw something that made my blood run cold. The walls of my room were bare, the same dull color they had been since we moved in. I was staring at my own reflection in the window when I noticed something moving in the shadows. It was so subtle, so faint, that I might have missed it if I hadn't been staring so intently. A shadow. It appeared on the wall, moving slowly, deliberately, as if it were aware of my gaze. The shadow wasn't just a flicker of light. It was a figure, shaped like a person, walking slowly across the wall. I felt my breath catch in my throat as it continued its journey across the room. It seemed to stop at the spot where the crack in the wall and the bed met. I watched in horror as the figure paused, then slowly lifted its hand, almost like it was waving at me. I froze, staring at it, my heart racing in my chest. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. The shadow slowly disappeared, vanishing into the darkness. I ran out of the room again, my small legs carrying me as fast as they could. I felt like something was lurking, waiting for me to look away. I never told my parents about that shadow, though. I didn't think they'd believe me, just like they didn't believe me about the hand. But I knew what I had seen. I knew it wasn't my imagination. To this day, I can still feel the fear of that night in my chest, like it's never really left. I don't know what it was or how it happened, but I know it was real. And no matter what my father said, no matter how much he tried to convince me it was a dream, I knew that something strange had happened in that room. Something that wasn't easily explained.